Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Mountain in Montana. I arrived in Montana just as the sun began to dip behind the towering peaks of the Rockies, casting long shadows over the sleepy little town I had come to visit. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the distant promise of snow. It was everything I had imagined, a quiet retreat, far from the noise of city life, a place to clear my mind. But there was something about the atmosphere that felt off. The village, though picturesque, seemed to be holding its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. The streets were narrow, lined with old wooden houses, their paint peeling in places, but they still stood with a quiet pride, like the residents had no intention of ever leaving. As I walked through the town, I noticed that the people moved a little slower than I was used to, eyes lingering on me for just a moment longer than was comfortable, expressions that barely hid their curiosity. They were friendly enough, but there was a hesitancy in their smiles. I made my way to the inn where I had booked a room for the night. The building was rustic, with a wooden porch and a warm glow spilling from the windows. Inside, the fire crackled, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. The innkeeper, an older woman with a weathered face and gray hair, greeted me with a nod, but there was something in her eyes, a depth, like she had seen too much of the world and was reluctant to let it affect her. "Not many travelers come through here," she said, her voice quiet. "Most people don't like to venture up into the mountains. Not after what happened." Her words hung in the air like an unspoken warning. I raised an eyebrow, curious, but didn't push for details. I was here to hike, to see the sights, not to listen to old ghost stories. But there was a strange weight to her words. After settling in, I stepped out onto the porch, looking up at the vast expanse of the mountain range looming in the distance. The peaks were shrouded in mist, as though they were trying to keep their secrets hidden from the world below. It was hard to shake the feeling that the mountain was watching me, waiting. The village was quiet, too quiet, and the wind carried an eerie chill as it howled through the streets. I shook off the unease, telling myself it was just the isolation of the place. But deep down, I couldn't help but wonder, was something watching me? Or was it just the mountain, silently observing all who dared to come near? The next morning, I couldn't ignore the mountain any longer. It loomed over the village like an ancient, silent guardian, its jagged peaks scraping at the sky, hidden by a thick veil of mist. Even from a distance, it felt imposing, as though the mountain held its own secrets, guarded fiercely by the winds and the clouds that swirled around its summit. The sheer scale of it was enough to make anyone feel small, insignificant. It was the kind of mountain that commanded respect, but there was something in the way it stood there, still and unwavering, that made my skin crawl. I spent the morning walking around the village, trying to shake off the feeling that the mountain was somehow alive. The locals went about their day, though there was an underlying tension in the air. Conversations paused whenever someone mentioned the mountain, and their eyes would flicker nervously, as if they feared that speaking too openly about it might draw its attention. I stopped by a small cafe, hoping to grab a cup of coffee before heading out on my hike. An older man sat in the corner, nursing a mug of tea. His weathered face was covered with a thick beard, his hands rough from years of work. He caught my eye as I entered, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he set down his cup. "Planning to head up there?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. He gestured toward the mountain through the window, his gaze lingering on it for a moment too long. I nodded, unsure of what to say. I thought I'd hike a trail this afternoon. It's supposed to be a beautiful view from the top. The man's eyes darkened. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You'd be better off staying down here. People go up that mountain and never come back. Oh, they say it's a beautiful place, sure, but there's something wrong about it. You can't trust what you see up there. I frowned, puzzled. What do you mean? The mountain, he hesitated, glancing around the room to ensure no one was listening. It's not just a mountain. Some say it's haunted. There's a curse, a restless spirit that lives up there. No one knows exactly what happened, but anyone who's tried to climb it has disappeared. It's as if the mountain draws them in. His words hung in the air, chilling me more than I expected. You really believe that? I asked, trying to laugh it off, though a shiver ran down my spine. He didn't smile. I've lived here all my life, seen enough strange things to know better than to ignore the warnings. You can go if you like, but don't say I didn't warn you. The mountain's got a way of getting into your head. People who go up there often, well, they never return quite the same. I thanked him and quickly left the cafe, my mind racing. The more I thought about it, the more his words started to feel heavier, like they were sinking into my chest. I tried to convince myself that it was just an old man's tale, something to scare the tourists away. But even as I walked through the village, I could feel the eyes of the others on me, a quiet warning in their glances. As I looked up again at the mountain, its peaks were no longer just towering over the village, they were watching me. The mist had thickened, cloaking the summit, and the wind began to pick up, carrying with it a whisper, almost like a distant voice, lost in the howl of the breeze. It felt as though the mountain was calling me, pulling me in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me up there, something old, something forgotten. And it was patient. It had all the time in the world. That afternoon, I decided to head down to the village's small general store, hoping to gather a few last-minute supplies for my hike. The shop was tucked into a corner of the village, its wooden sign creaking in the wind as I approached. Inside, the shelves were lined with everything from hiking gear to jars of homemade jam, and the air smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. A bell chimed softly as I stepped in, and a man behind the counter looked up from his newspaper. He was younger than most of the villagers, maybe in his 30s, with short, dark hair and a rugged face that seemed worn from years of working in the wild. His eyes, however, were sharp and alert, constantly scanning the store as if he was watching for something that wasn't immediately visible. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice low but friendly enough. "I'm just getting ready for a hike up the mountain," I said, giving him a casual smile. Figured I'd get a few things before heading out. The man's expression faltered, and his eyes quickly darted to the window, where the mountain loomed just beyond the village. His gaze lingered there, distant, as if something had caught his attention. For a moment, he didn't respond, and I began to wonder if I'd said something wrong. Finally, he spoke, his tone much quieter now. "You're new here, right? Not from around these parts?" I nodded. "Yeah, just arrived yesterday. Thought I'd check out the mountain." The man chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it. He wiped his hands on his worn apron and leaned forward on the counter, lowering his voice to a whisper. "I wouldn't go up there if I were you." I felt a chill run down my spine, and the casual mood I'd been carrying evaporated. I raised an eyebrow, unsure if he was just trying to scare me off, but his serious tone made me hesitate. "Why's that?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant, but my curiosity was piqued. His eyes flicked toward the door, checking the street, before he stepped closer, almost as though he didn't want anyone else to hear. There's an old legend around here. People have been talking about it for generations. They say that the mountain is cursed, haunted, even. There are ghostly figures that appear to those who wander too far off the trail. They don't look like the living, not really. They're shadows. They move in the mist, always heading down the mountain, but no one knows where they come from or where they go. I swallowed, unsure of what to make of his words. The mountain had already unsettled me, but hearing this story made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Ghosts? I scoffed, trying to brush it off. Sounds like just a tale to keep tourists away. The man didn't smile. It's not just a story. People have gone missing on that mountain, and not just recently. Decades ago, too. Hikers, climbers, all of them, they vanish without a trace. And if you ask the right people, the ones who've lived here long enough, they'll tell you they've seen the figures too. Walking down the mountain in the early mornings, disappearing into the fog. I laughed nervously, feeling awkward now. You really believe that? He leaned back slightly, his expression grave. I don't know what I believe, but I've seen things. And you'd be wise to listen to the old stories. Something happens up there. The mountain, it has a way of pulling people in. You'll hear footsteps behind you when you're all alone. Voices calling your name. Sometimes you'll see the figures moving in the mist, and you'll think they're just other climbers, but they're not. They never stop. They never speak. I shifted on my feet, suddenly feeling very aware of the emptiness of the store, the silence pressing in. What happens to them? The people who see these figures, I mean. The man's gaze grew distant, as though he was looking back into some dark memory. Most of them disappear. Those who don't, well, they say they come back changed. Different. Quiet. As if a part of them stayed behind, up there in the fog. Some never speak again. Some go mad. But the worst part is this, the figures, they're not just after the living. No. They're after more than that. I felt the room grow colder, and for a moment, the air around me seemed to thicken. What do you mean? He met my eyes, his voice dropping lower. They lead you. They lure you to follow them, and the ones who do, they end up like the rest. Lost. Trapped in the mountain, forever. It's like the mountain takes them, keeps them as part of its own. Some of the villagers say that the figures, they're climbers who died long ago, still trying to find their way down, pulling the living into the same fate. I looked toward the window again, the mountain now looming even larger in my vision. The mist had thickened, swirling around the base, creeping up the sides like fingers reaching toward the village. I felt an irrational shiver run down my spine, and for the first time since arriving, the idea of hiking up there seemed less like an adventure and more like a mistake. The man's voice snapped me back to reality. Just be careful. It's not just a hike. It's a warning. And sometimes, that mountain, it listens. I nodded, not sure what to say. I paid for the supplies and left the store, the man's words echoing in my head. As I stepped back onto the quiet streets of the village, the mountain seemed even more imposing than before. The fog was thicker now, curling around the edges of the trees, and the air felt heavier, pressing against me. And as I looked up one last time, I swore I saw something moving in the mist, a figure, just at the edge of the tree line, descending from the mountain. The next few hours passed in a blur. I tried to shake off the conversation with the man from the store, dismissing it as nothing more than a local legend, an old ghost story meant to scare people like me. But as the afternoon wore on, I couldn't escape the growing feeling that something was wrong. I decided to take a short walk around the village to clear my head before dinner. The air had grown colder, and the fog seemed to settle deeper in the valley, swallowing the distant outlines of the houses and the trees. It was as though the village was slowly being enveloped by something unseen, but they're all the same. As I walked down the main street, I noticed a few villagers giving me odd looks. Their gazes were quick, almost as if they were watching me from the corners of their eyes, too quick for me to be sure. I had the strange sense that they were waiting for something they were too afraid to speak about. Their glances lingered just a moment too long, their expressions unreadable, but when I made eye contact, they quickly looked away, returning to their work or conversations as if nothing had happened. A slight unease crept up on me, and I quickened my pace, feeling an inexplicable urge to move through the village as quickly as possible. The feeling of being watched became stronger with every step, the oppressive silence around me pressing in, making it hard to breathe. I turned a corner, trying to push the discomfort aside, but as I did, I caught a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I stopped dead in my tracks. For a split second, I thought I saw something move, just a shadow, a fleeting figure, disappearing behind one of the houses. But it hadn't been a person, it had been too quick, too dark, and the shape hadn't been human. My heart began to race, and I forced myself to take a deep breath, telling myself it was nothing. Just my imagination playing tricks. But as I continued walking, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I decided to make my way toward the edge of the village, where the mountain was just visible, towering above the trees. The closer I got to the edge, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The fog was thicker here, swirling in the air like it had a life of its own, and the mountain loomed just beyond, its peak lost in the mist. I stood there for a few minutes, staring up at the towering mass of rock, trying to convince myself that there was nothing to fear. But the longer I looked, the more it felt as though the mountain was somehow drawing me in, its presence weighing heavily on my chest, like a silent command to come closer. Suddenly, I saw it. A figure, standing at the base of the mountain, just inside the tree line. It was distant, too far for me to make out any details, but it was unmistakable. The figure stood perfectly still, as though it was waiting for me. My breath caught in my throat, and I blinked, trying to clear the fog from my mind. When I looked again, the figure was gone. I stepped back, heart pounding, my mind racing. I had only looked away for a moment, just a moment. But the figure had vanished, as though it had never been there at all. I shook my head, telling myself it was the mist playing tricks on me. But something about the way it had been standing there, so still, so deliberate, unsettled me. And there was something else, a feeling deep in my gut that told me I wasn't imagining things. That figure, it hadn't been a person. Not really. As I turned to leave, I felt it again, the unmistakable sensation that I was being watched. It was the same feeling I'd gotten earlier in the village, but stronger now, more intense. I quickened my pace, glancing over my shoulder every few steps, half expecting to see someone, or something, behind me. I reached the inn and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. But as I stood there, my heart still pounding, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mountain was calling me. That it wanted something from me, and it wouldn't rest until it had it. The shadows outside flickered again, stretching long and thin as the sun dipped lower, casting eerie shapes against the walls of the inn. I tried to ignore them, to tell myself they were just the shadows of trees swaying in the wind. But deep down, I knew the mountain was not just a place. It was a presence. And I was beginning to understand that it was far from empty. I tried to calm my nerves and settled into a chair near the fire, hoping the warmth would ease the chill in my bones. But the flickering shadows outside continued to dance along the windows, and I couldn't help but wonder, what had I just seen? And more importantly, what was still watching me from the edge of the mountain? The night dragged on slowly, each passing minute seeming heavier than the last. I sat in the small inn, trying to drown out the unsettling thoughts swirling in my mind, but the shadows outside the window kept drawing my attention. Every time I glanced toward the glass, I half expected to see something, a figure, a movement, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I told myself I was being ridiculous. The figure at the base of the mountain, the strange flickers at the edge of my vision, it could all be chalked up to nothing more than overactive imagination. The stories the villagers told, the old man in the cafe, the man at the store, they were just warnings, tales passed down over generations to keep people safe. Right? But what if there was more to it than that? A part of me, the adventurous part that had driven me to travel here in the first place, felt a pull. Something was calling me to the mountain. Maybe it was just curiosity, or maybe it was the thrill of proving that I wasn't afraid, but whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to see it for myself. The warnings haunted me, but the idea of the unknown, of what might lie atop the mountain, was stronger. The villagers had all looked at me with that same quiet fear in their eyes, but none of them had gone up there. How many times had they let the mountain scare them into inaction? I wasn't like that. I wasn't going to let fear control me. The idea of the ghostly figures, the lost climbers, the whispers on the wind, they only made the mountain seem more mysterious, more alluring. I had come all this way for adventure, to test myself against the unknown, and now I was going to turn back because of a few ghost stories? It didn't make sense. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the wooden floor with a sharp screech that echoed in the quiet room. The fire crackled softly in the corner, casting warm light over the walls, but all I could think about was the mountain. It was still there, waiting for me, just beyond the veil of mist. And I was certain that if I didn't climb it now, the questions would linger. The doubts would continue to gnaw at me. What was so special about that place? What did the villagers know that they weren't telling me? I grabbed my pack from the corner, the straps creaking slightly under the weight. I stuffed in the last of my supplies, water, snacks, a flashlight, and slung it over my shoulder. The quiet of the room suddenly felt stifling, as though the air was too thick, too heavy with anticipation. I was ready. I was going. Before stepping out the door, I hesitated. For a moment, I stood in the doorway, staring out at the darkened village street, the fog still swirling in the air. The mountain loomed beyond the trees, barely visible in the mist, but it felt as though it were watching me. Waiting. "Be careful," the man at the store had said. The words echoed in my mind. And the old man in the cafe, his warnings about the figures on the mountain, still lingered. Could they be right? I shook my head. No. I wasn't going to let fear control me. I wasn't going to back down from this. There was something about the mountain that felt like a challenge, an invitation that I couldn't refuse. I stepped outside into the cold night air, the fog thickening around me, and began walking toward the edge of the village. The streets were quiet, the only sound the crunch of my boots against the gravel path. As I walked, I kept glancing up at the mountain. The further I went, the more the fog seemed to swallow the landscape. The towering peaks were obscured, but I could still feel their presence, their weight, pressing down on me. I reached the trailhead at the base of the mountain, where the path began to wind its way up into the trees. The air here was colder, the silence deeper, as if the mountain itself were holding its breath. The world around me felt suspended, as though time had slowed down, waiting for me to make the next move. I hesitated for a moment, taking in the narrow trail that disappeared into the dark forest. The fog hung in the trees like a thick curtain, making everything seem distant, unreachable. The sounds of the village were now far behind me, replaced by the eerie stillness of the mountain. There was no turning back now. I set my jaw and began the climb. The first few steps were easy enough, just a steady incline through the trees, the ground firm beneath my boots. But with every step, the feeling of isolation grew stronger. The world beyond the trees was silent, the only sounds my own breath and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The mountain seemed to absorb all other noise, as though it were a place outside of time, removed from the world I had known. As I climbed higher, the mist thickened, curling around the trees like ghostly fingers. The air grew heavier, colder, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. The path was becoming steeper, the footing more uneven, but I pressed on, driven by the need to reach the summit, to uncover the truth for myself. Then, at the edge of the tree line, I stopped. There, just ahead of me, I saw it, a shadow. A flicker of movement in the mist, something moving where there should be nothing. I froze, my heart racing, every muscle tensed. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, but then it moved again, faster this time, darting between the trees. It was as if something was just out of sight, something watching me from the fog. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. It wasn't a person. It couldn't be. But the mountain seemed to be playing tricks on me, pulling me deeper into its mystery. I had made my decision. There was no turning back now. And whatever waited for me up there, whether it was the truth or something far darker, I was going to find it. The air was colder than I had expected, a biting chill that cut through the layers of my jacket as I stood at the foot of the mountain. The fog swirled around my feet, thick and impenetrable, as though the earth itself was breathing in the mist. It was so still, unnaturally still, that it felt like I was stepping into a world completely cut off from the rest of time. I took my first step onto the narrow path that wound its way upward, the gravel crunching underfoot in a way that felt too loud, too sharp for the silence that enveloped everything. The mountain stood towering before me, an ominous presence that seemed to loom over the village below, its peak hidden in the haze. I tried not to let my mind wander back to the stories I had heard, the warnings that had followed me to this place. It wasn't as if I had anything to fear, right? This was just a mountain. But as I walked further, the silence around me seemed to grow. It was the kind of quiet that presses in on you, the kind that makes you feel like your every breath, every movement, is too loud. The trees around me were thick and dense, their branches twisting together like gnarled fingers, and the trail narrowed even further as I climbed. I couldn't see much beyond the fog that curled around the trunks of the trees, only shadows and shapes shifting in the periphery of my vision. Every so often, a gust of wind would blow through, carrying with it a faint, eerie sound, something between a whisper and a sigh. I couldn't make out any words, but it was enough to set the hairs on the back of my neck standing. I paused for a moment, glancing behind me. The village was far below now, swallowed by the dense fog. The sound of the wind was all that reached my ears, and I felt more alone than I had ever felt before. This place, this mountain, had a way of erasing everything that existed beyond it. It felt as though nothing in the world could touch me here. I shook off the creeping feeling in my chest and pressed on. one foot in front of the other. The further I climbed, the colder it became. The mist seemed to thicken, swirling around me in long tendrils that reached out like hands, caressing my skin with an unnatural coldness. The path had begun to incline more steeply, the ground underfoot loose and uneven, making every step more difficult than the last. I steadied myself with my hands against the trees, gripping the rough bark for support. There was no sound now, nothing but the soft scrape of my boots against the dirt and the occasional rustle of leaves, but I couldn't help but feel as though I was being watched. The shadows in the trees seemed to stretch longer, their forms shifting as I passed, but when I turned to look, they were always still. My breath came in short bursts now, the cold air stinging my lungs as I pushed forward, deeper into the mountain's grasp. I tried to focus on the climb, on the trail ahead of me, but the silence weighed heavily on me. The further I went, the more isolated I felt, like I was disappearing into some other world, a world where time no longer had any meaning, and the only thing that mattered was the mountain. The air was so thin up here, I could taste it on my tongue, sharp and cold. And then, I heard something. It was faint at first, a sound that could have been the wind, but then it grew clearer. A soft crunching, like boots on gravel. I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned quickly, scanning the fog behind me. Nothing. Just the empty path winding down, vanishing into the mist. My breath was coming faster now, the adrenaline in my veins making everything sharper, more intense. I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat thumping in my ears. I shook my head, forcing myself to take a deep breath. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. The fog had a way of distorting sound, of making you hear things that weren't there. The mountain was messing with my head. But as I turned back to the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. I continued my ascent, though with each step, the air seemed to grow thicker, colder, as if the mountain itself was drawing in the world around me. My breath formed small clouds that quickly dissipated in the chill, and the fog grew denser, swirling around me with an unsettling heaviness. The silence that had dominated earlier was now broken by the faintest of sounds. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the soft rustling of leaves or the faint creak of a branch shifting in the wind. But then, it came again, a soft crunch in the distance. The sound of footsteps, deliberate, but slow and measured. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The sound was unmistakable, but the trail was empty. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone there, maybe another hiker, someone who had decided to brave the mountain like I had. But no one was in sight. Only the dense fog and the towering trees, their branches swaying ever so slightly in the wind. I shook my head, trying to clear the unease settling in my stomach. It was the wind, I told myself. Just the wind, carrying sound in strange ways through the fog. But the sound persisted, faint and distant, like footsteps shuffling on gravel. It seemed to echo around me, stretching out in every direction, yet there was no source. It was as though it was coming from the mountain itself, from deep within its shadowy heart. I continued walking, the crunch of my own boots against the trail the only solid sound I could hold on to. But the feeling of being watched was growing stronger, gnawing at the edges of my mind, wrapping itself around my thoughts until I couldn't shake it. Every few steps, I would hear the crunching again, closer now, but no one was there. I stopped again, listening intently. The wind had picked up, and it was no longer the gentle breeze I had felt earlier. Now, it howled through the trees, carrying with it a strange, hollow sound, a low, almost mournful whistle that seemed to echo from somewhere deep within the mountain. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the direction, but it was impossible. The fog twisted and moved like a living thing, obscuring everything beyond a few feet ahead. I swallowed, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The wind was picking up pace, tugging at my clothes, making it harder to move forward. It felt as though the air was growing heavier, pressing against me, forcing me to slow. The trees around me groaned under the weight of the wind, their limbs creaking and shaking. Yet there was no sign of any storm, no sign of anything that should be causing such a violent disturbance in the air. Another crunch. But this time, it was closer, much closer. I could almost feel the earth beneath my boots shift, as if something, or someone, was just behind me, walking along the trail. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone emerging from the fog. But again, there was nothing. Just the twisted trees, the ghostly mists, and the deepening silence. It was then that I realized the wind wasn't just blowing, it was moving in a pattern, almost deliberate. As if it were guiding me, pushing me further into the heart of the mountain. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and the breeze carried with it an unsettling scent, something sharp, like damp stone or decaying wood. It didn't smell like the fresh mountain air I had expected, but something old, something forgotten. I tightened my grip on the straps of my pack and continued climbing, but my pace had slowed. Every sound, every subtle shift in the air, made my skin crawl. The trees around me seemed to stretch higher, their branches twisting in strange, unnatural angles. The fog swirled in tight circles, and I could have sworn I saw figures moving within it, just shadows at the edge of my vision, too quick to be certain. Then came the unmistakable sound of a footstep, soft but distinct. I froze once more, my heart hammering in my chest. The trail in front of me was still empty. And then I heard it again. This time, it wasn't in the distance. It was just behind me. The crunch of boots against the gravel, moving steadily, steadily closer. My breath caught in my throat, and I slowly turned around, expecting to find someone standing there. But there was no one. The path behind me was as empty as the one ahead. The fog clung to the trees like a shroud, obscuring the view, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the feeling. The feeling that something was there, watching, waiting. The next sound came not from the ground, but from the trees themselves, a low groan, almost like a whisper, as though the mountain itself was sighing. I shuddered, the cold air seeping deeper into my bones, and I realized that I was no longer sure whether the sound was natural or something far darker. The mountain had begun to shift, to make its presence felt, and I was no longer certain I was welcome here. With every step I took, the air seemed to close in on me, the shadows around me growing longer, darker. The footsteps, imagined were real, were no longer the only sounds I could hear. There was something else. A faint rustling, like something moving through the trees, something that wasn't quite human. The feeling of being pursued was no longer a passing thought. It was real. I was being followed. And now, there was no escape. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that invisible eyes were tracking my every movement. The air had thickened, each breath a laborious pull of cold, damp air that only made the isolation more suffocating. I kept my head low, my boots scraping against the uneven trail, trying to push the unsettling thoughts from my mind. But the sounds, the footsteps, the whispering wind, the feeling of something following me had grown impossible to ignore. And then, in the midst of the fog, I saw it. A shadow. At first, it was nothing more than a flicker, something that moved too quickly to be certain of, a fleeting distortion in the mist. I stopped, heart racing in my chest, my eyes darting toward the edge of the path where the shadow had been. Nothing. But then it came again. This time, more distinct. The figure was tall, taller than any person I had ever seen. Its shape was shrouded in the fog, but there was no mistaking the outline. A silhouette. It was standing just off the trail, where the trees began to thicken, half hidden in the mist, but I could make out the shape of a body, slender, unnaturally tall. The figure didn't move, not at first. It stood there, motionless, as though it was waiting for something. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I knew I should move, run, anything. But something held me there. My legs refused to obey my mind. The longer I stared at it, the less it seemed like a trick of the light, the less it seemed like my imagination running wild. This wasn't a trick. The figure was real. I took a step forward, my breath coming in shallow bursts. The fog seemed to coil tighter around me, the shadows deepening, pressing in on all sides. I could see the figure's outline more clearly now, the way it shifted slightly, as though adjusting to my gaze. It was dressed in dark clothing, almost tattered, its form impossible to define. The edges of the figure seemed to bleed into the fog itself, merging with the mist in a way that didn't seem natural. I blinked, thinking I had imagined it, but when I opened my eyes again, it was still there. And this time, it was moving. Slowly. Its movements were jerky, unnaturally fluid, as though it didn't quite belong in the space between the trees. It took a step toward me, one slow, deliberate motion, its feet brushing the ground with a soft, almost inaudible sound. I froze. A part of me screamed to turn around, to run, but my feet remained rooted to the ground. The figure was too solid, too real, to be a figment of my imagination. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat reverberating through my body like a drum. Then it stopped. Just stopped. Right in the middle of the trail, blocking my path forward. The mist swirled around it, thickening until it was all I could see, until the figure and the fog were one, indistinguishable. I took another step forward, almost against my will, driven by some primal instinct. The figure didn't move. I wasn't sure if I was relieved or terrified. Was it waiting for me? Watching me? Or was it simply there? I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, just the way the fog played with the shadows, the way the wind shifted the trees. But even as I told myself this, a cold certainty settled in my bones. This wasn't normal. This wasn't natural. Then, in an instant, it was gone. One moment, it was standing in front of me, blocking my path, and the next, it vanished into the fog. Not a sound. No movement. Nothing. The air seemed to grow even colder in the wake of its disappearance, the silence swallowing everything once again. I blinked rapidly, my mind scrambling to process what had just happened. There had to be some logical explanation. Perhaps it was another hiker, someone dressed strangely, someone who had been walking ahead of me. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how impossible that explanation was. No one had been on the trail when I first arrived. And the way it moved, so unnatural, so wrong, it couldn't have been anyone living. I stood frozen for a moment, my hands trembling at my sides. The mist continued to swirl around me, thick and suffocating, and the path ahead was now shrouded in an oppressive, otherworldly stillness. My mind raced, my thoughts a whirlwind of doubt and fear, but the one thing I couldn't shake was the absolute certainty that I was no longer alone. The mountain was watching me, and it was not going to let me go. I stood there, the fog swirling around me like a blanket, the eerie stillness pressing down harder with each passing second. My heart was still racing, pounding against my chest as though it might break free. I had to calm down. I had to think clearly. There was a perfectly rational explanation for what I had just seen, I told myself. Maybe I had been up here too long, my mind was playing tricks on me. The isolation, the lack of human contact, it was starting to take its toll. The fog, dense and suffocating, had a way of distorting shapes, of turning ordinary shadows into something far more menacing. It's just the fog, I thought, taking a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. Just a trick of the light, something your eyes conjured up to make sense of the strange environment around you. I tried to tell myself that I had been seeing things. The mountain had a way of distorting reality, of warping perception. The shifting light, the twisting shapes in the mist, of course, it could have looked like a figure standing on the path. The human mind is prone to pattern recognition, even when there is no pattern to be found. It's why we see faces in clouds or hear voices in the wind. It's all in your head, I repeated silently. Just the fog and the wind playing games with your senses. I took a few steps forward, trying to push the thoughts from my mind. The crunch of my boots against the gravel trail was a solid anchor, a reminder that I was still here, still grounded in reality. But with each step, the uneasy feeling in my stomach grew. I couldn't shake the image of the figure, the way it had stood still in the mist, the way it seemed too real. No, I couldn't let myself get caught up in that. The idea of a ghost, or some spirit of the mountain, was absurd. Ridiculous. This was just a mountain, after all, a physical place, governed by the same rules that applied to any other. No room for supernatural nonsense here. I stopped for a moment, closing my eyes and focusing on the sound of my own breath. The chill in the air cut through my jacket, but it was a cold I could understand. The mountain had its own climate, its own set of rules. The fog wasn't unusual, the wind was strong in high altitudes, shifting the mist and making shapes appear out of nothing. I had been warned about how easily one could lose their sense of orientation in these parts. You're just tired, I thought. You've been walking for hours, and the air is thin up here. It's easy to start seeing things that aren't there. I nodded to myself, the rational part of my brain fighting to regain control. A hiker had likely passed me earlier and I hadn't noticed. They blended into the fog, and I hadn't seen them clearly. They might have even turned off the path ahead, disappearing into the trees, their form becoming indistinguishable from the mist. That's it. I breathed in deep, exhaling slowly. Just a trick of the environment. There were no ghosts. There were no shadows lurking in the fog. Only the mountain and its natural forces. That's what I had to focus on. The fog, the wind, the shifting shadows, it was all explainable. But even as I convinced myself of this, a part of me lingered on the feeling of the figure, the way it had moved, so strangely, so wrong. My thoughts faltered. The wind had changed direction, picking up again, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Was it the wind that made the shadows seem so solid, or was it something else? Something I didn't want to consider? I turned back to the trail, determined to keep moving, to shake off the unease that clung to me like a second skin. The mountain had a way of making even the most rational thoughts seem distant. Keep going. Focus. The faster you move, the easier this will all seem. But as I moved forward, I couldn't shake the lingering feeling that I wasn't alone on the trail. That the mountain wasn't just a place of natural beauty, it was something more, something darker. No, I thought, shaking my head. That wasn't true. This was just a mountain. But the more I walked, the more I felt that something was waiting for me just beyond the edge of my perception. It was the kind of feeling you get when you know someone is standing behind you, even if you haven't seen them. It's just the fog, I told myself again, more desperately this time. It's all in your head. I couldn't stay here forever. I had come this far, and I wasn't about to let a fleeting shadow, or the whispers of my own paranoia, stop me now. I had spent too many hours planning this hike, too much time dreaming of what it would be like to conquer the mountain. My legs were aching from the climb, but I pushed through the fatigue, determined to see this through. The fog pressed in tighter now, wrapping around me like a cold, suffocating blanket. It clung to my skin, damp and heavy, making every movement feel like I was wading through a thick, invisible sea. The trail ahead seemed to narrow as the mist deepened, the trees growing denser with each step. They reached for me, their twisted branches scraping against my shoulders, their shadows more menacing in the growing twilight. It's just the fog, I reminded myself again, trying to drown out the nagging sense of unease. Just a trick of the light. But my heart didn't listen. It hammered in my chest, faster now, as if it knew something I didn't want to admit. I turned my focus back to the path ahead. I could still hear the wind rustling the trees, the low murmur of the mountain surrounding me. Yet, the deeper I went, the more I felt the air growing still, as though the world was holding its breath. The noises, once so comforting, the sounds of nature, had quieted, leaving only a strange, heavy silence behind. I took another step forward, forcing my legs to carry me, ignoring the trembling of my hands. The cold was biting now, sharper than before, and my breath began to mist in front of me, swirling in the thickening fog. It wasn't like the crisp air I had grown accustomed to in the lower elevations. It was oppressive, smothering, as if the mountain itself was trying to suffocate me. The only sounds left were the distant rustling of the wind and the steady rhythm of my boots crunching on the gravel. My thoughts felt hazy, too. The longer I walked, the more it seemed as though time was bending. The fog made it impossible to gauge how far I had come, how much longer I had to go. My sense of direction was slipping, and I began to wonder if I was even still on the same trail. Every turn looked the same, the trees and rocks melting into the mist in ways that felt wrong. How could I have walked so far without seeing anything familiar? The sense of isolation intensified with each step, creeping into my bones. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to ward off the chill, but it wasn't the cold that was making me shiver. It was the feeling that something had shifted in the air, that I was no longer just hiking on a mountain, I was intruding. And whatever watched from the fog didn't want me here. I stumbled over a loose rock, my foot catching awkwardly on the uneven trail. The noise echoed too loudly in the stillness, my breath catching in my throat as I quickly steadied myself. Focus, I thought, wiping my sweaty palms on my pants. Focus on the path. But it wasn't enough. The stillness had become too oppressive, and the mountain had stopped feeling like a place of adventure and discovery. It felt more like a place of foreboding, as though every step I took was being watched, being measured. My mind was spinning. Could I really keep going? I didn't even know where I was headed anymore. But there was still that nagging voice inside me, the voice that told me I had to push through. I had come for the challenge. I had come to face the mountain. I couldn't stop now. So, I kept walking. I ignored the growing sense of dread in my gut, the whisper of instinct telling me to turn around. The deeper I went, the thicker the fog became. My vision was reduced to just a few feet in front of me, the trees and rocks around me blurry shapes that seemed to shift with the wind. There was no telling where the trail ended or what lay ahead. The further I went, the the more it seemed as though the mountain itself was closing in, as though I were walking into the heart of something ancient and unknowable. Then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I noticed something. A faint, flickering light through the mist. I stopped dead in my tracks. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It looked like the glow of a distant lantern, the kind hikers sometimes carried when they ventured out in the dark. My heart skipped a beat. Was there someone else out here? Someone who could guide me, show me the way forward? But the more I looked, the more the light seemed to shift, twisting and undulating in the fog as though it were being carried on the wind. It wasn't a steady light at all. In fact, it was erratic, moving as if the source were walking or floating. I took a cautious step toward it, curiosity pushing me forward despite the creeping terror in my chest. But the closer I got, the more the light seemed to move away, pulling back into the fog, just out of reach. I quickened my pace, my breath shallow. I had to see what it was. But as I approached, the light vanished, swallowed by the mist in an instant, as though it had never existed at all. The trail was empty again, the darkness and fog reclaiming their hold on the mountain. The silence was deafening. I stood still, the weight of the moment settling on me. The further I pushed into the mountain, the more it seemed to change, become something else. Something that was not just a place, but something alive. Something that didn't want me here. And yet, I still couldn't bring myself to turn back. I had come this far. The mountain had me in its grip now. With each step deeper into the mountain, the air thickened, as though the very atmosphere itself was pressing down on me. The fog had transformed from a mere inconvenience to a living entity, swallowing the light, distorting the world around me. The trail was becoming increasingly treacherous, the rocks slick with moisture, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to shift with every step I took. It wasn't just the physical environment that was changing. The mountain was changing. I could feel it in my bones, in the way the silence pressed in on me, making my heartbeat sound unnaturally loud in my ears. It was as though the very mountain was alive, listening to my every movement, watching with 1,000 unseen eyes. The wind had stopped entirely, and the fog swirled unnaturally around me, as though it had a mind of its own, reacting to my presence. I shivered, wrapping my arms around myself, but it wasn't the cold that was making me tremble now. There was something else, something more visceral. The air felt wrong, thick with a sense of foreboding, as if the mountain was about to reveal something terrible. The trees, once sparse but imposing, had grown denser, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes, like fingers reaching out to grab me. Their shadows stretched unnaturally long, flickering in the corner of my eyes, vanishing when I turned to look. It was as if I had crossed an invisible threshold, a boundary that should not have been crossed. The deeper I ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees, their roots entangled in the earth like old, rotting hands, now seemed to close in on the path. The fog, so thick that it blurred the line between reality and illusion, made it impossible to see anything beyond a few feet ahead of me. The feeling of isolation was crushing, like I was standing at the edge of the world, and the rest of humanity had vanished, leaving me to face whatever lay beyond the veil of mist. A distant sound reached my ears, a faint rustling like dry leaves stirring in the wind, but there was no wind. It was so faint, I almost thought I had imagined it, until it came again, this time louder, more distinct. The sound was footsteps. Soft, slow, deliberate. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as the realization settled in. I wasn't alone on the mountain. Someone, or something, was walking behind me. I turned sharply, my eyes scanning the fog, but all I could see was the swirling mist. There was no one there. Nothing. The trail was empty. Yet, the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder, more distinct, but they weren't coming from in front of me. They were coming from behind. A slow, rhythmic pace, as though someone, or something, was following me, shadowing my every move. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My mind raced for a logical explanation. Could it be another hiker? Someone else lost in the fog? But no, the path was too narrow, and the distance between us felt too great for it to be a coincidence. Whoever, or whatever, was behind me was moving with purpose. I couldn't hear their breathing, no shuffling of boots, just the soft, steady thud of footsteps in time with my own. Stay calm, I told myself. Stay rational. It was all I could do to keep from breaking into a panicked run. I needed to focus. I needed to keep moving. I could feel my pulse quicken, the sweat prickling at the back of my neck despite the cold. The footsteps kept pace with me, like a shadow I couldn't outrun, growing nearer even though I wasn't sure how. I could feel them on my heels, just out of sight, but with every step I took, they were closer. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. The world seemed to hold its breath, the silence stretching painfully long. My legs froze in place, my body rigid with tension. The mountain was holding its breath, waiting for something. And then I saw it. Out of the fog, just beyond the reach of my vision, there was movement. The same fleeting shadow I had seen earlier, standing motionless in the mist. It was no longer just a trick of the light, it was real. A figure, darker than the shadows around it, a silhouette that barely registered against the dense fog. But there was no mistaking it now. It was human-shaped, too solid to be a trick of my mind, but too strange to be anything I could easily understand. The figure stood there, motionless, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold, empty. Its presence seemed to suck the warmth from the air, leaving nothing but a sense of dread in its wake. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, and my legs felt like lead. I was rooted to the spot, unable to move, as if some invisible force had frozen me in place. And then, just like before, the figure moved. But it didn't walk. It floated, gliding effortlessly across the path, as though it were weightless, as though the ground beneath it meant nothing. It was drawing closer, inch by inch, and the world around me seemed to grow darker with each passing moment. The fog thickened, swirling faster now, as though the mountain itself was conspiring to hide whatever was coming for me. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to send a shiver of pure terror through me. But I couldn't stay here. I had to move. I had to keep going. I turned and began walking faster, forcing my legs to carry me despite the growing weight of fear pressing on my chest. The footsteps behind me resumed, soft, steady, relentless, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was following me wasn't human. The mountain was alive, and it was drawing me in. The fog had thickened so much that it felt like I was walking through a dream, one that I couldn't wake up from. Every step I took seemed to push me deeper into something I didn't fully understand, something that felt unnatural, as if the mountain had decided to swallow me whole. I quickened my pace, desperate to move forward, but my feet felt heavy. My legs burned from exhaustion, the muscles straining with every step. The air was colder now, biting at my skin with an intensity that felt unnatural for this altitude. And yet, it wasn't the cold that made my blood run cold, it was the sense that something was out of place, something watching, something just beyond my reach. As I pushed on, I noticed the figures again. But this time, they weren't just a fleeting shadow in the distance. No, they were real, more defined, emerging from the mist like phantoms. There were several of them now, scattered along the path ahead of me, and at first, I thought my mind was playing tricks. The figures moved like shadows, blurry at first, only faintly visible through the dense fog. But as I strained my eyes, trying to focus, I saw them clearer, more distinct. They were human-shaped, but not quite human. The figures were dressed in old, tattered climbing gear, worn, faded jackets and gear that looked far too outdated for a modern hike. Some of them were holding climbing ropes that looked frayed, the material aged and torn. Others clutched ice axes that seemed to gleam in the dim light, their movements slow, deliberate. They weren't heading up the mountain like normal climbers would. They were descending, moving downward in the exact same direction I was heading, as though they were guiding me, pulling me along in their wake. Their bodies were blurred, their outlines shifting in the mist, but their presence was unmistakable. I could feel them drawing closer, as though they were inching toward me, their faint footsteps lost in the windless air. I stopped in my tracks, heart pounding. My breath came in quick bursts as I watched them. I felt paralyzed, caught between the need to run and the pull of the mountain, the unexplainable urge to keep moving forward. But as I stared at them, I began to notice something even more disturbing. They weren't just descending the mountain in a regular manner. They were gliding down it, moving without the effort or strain that any human climber would experience. They floated, their feet never quite touching the ground, their movements smooth and unnatural, like they were being pulled by an invisible force. The sound of their steps, which had seemed so real at first, faded into the eerie silence, replaced by an almost imperceptible whisper in the air. I tried to tell myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. The exhaustion, the cold, the isolation, everything was getting to me. It had to be. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. I wasn't hallucinating. The figures were real. They were here, and they were heading toward me. I took a step backward, the hairs on my neck standing on end. But my feet refused to move. The figures were drawing closer now, and I felt a sudden, inexplicable pull toward them, as if my body were no longer my own. A force greater than my will was guiding me, pulling me forward, urging me to follow them down the mountain. I resisted it with every ounce of my being, but it was as if the mountain itself was calling to me, beckoning me to join the figures in their descent. The fog parted briefly, just enough to reveal more of the figures, and I saw their faces. Empty. Their faces were pale, hollow, their eyes dark and void of life. They didn't look at me, but I could feel their eyes on me all the same. There was no recognition, no humanity in them, just empty, cold stares that sent chills through me. They were the faces of the lost, of climbers who had died on the mountain, of people who had never made it back, who had somehow become trapped in the fog, forever descending, forever seeking something they would never reach. No, I thought, my pulse quickening. This isn't real. It can't be. But the figures kept moving toward me, their pace slow but deliberate. They weren't coming for me, not yet, but they were leading me, pulling me toward their path. I couldn't explain it, but it felt as if they were drawing me into the same fate that had claimed them. It was as if the mountain was cursed, trapping anyone who dared to venture too far into its heart, keeping them as part of its eternal descent. I turned around quickly, my breath ragged in my chest. I had to leave. I had to turn back before it was too late. But the figures, those eerie, shadowy shapes, were everywhere now, surrounding me, descending in a perfect, unnerving line. They weren't threatening me directly, but their presence was suffocating. The mountain had me, and I couldn't escape. The weight of their ghostly descent, the coldness of their hollow eyes, was pressing down on me with every step I took. I turned again, my heart racing, and began walking faster, trying to outrun the figures. The fog closed in tighter around me, the figures still floating just out of reach, moving down the mountain with me, as if I were one of them. And then, just as I thought I was free, the fog parted once again, and I saw them, more figures. They were ahead now, just visible in the swirling mist, their movements silent but deliberate. They were climbing up the mountain, not descending like the others, but climbing. They weren't climbing toward me. They were climbing upward, climbing toward their own deaths, to join the endless procession of the lost. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin as I realized the truth. The figures weren't just climbers who had died. They were the dead, cursed to roam the mountain forever, never to leave, forever climbing or descending, trapped in an endless cycle of death. And now, it seemed, I had joined them. The realization hit me like a physical blow, my heart slamming painfully in my chest. I couldn't escape this mountain. I was the mountain. My breath quickened, my chest tightening as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The figures had surrounded me now, their movements so unnatural, so devoid of life, that it was impossible to deny the truth any longer. These weren't lost hikers. They weren't survivors of some tragic mountaineering accident. These were the dead. As they glided past me, their faces frozen in hollow expressions, I could feel their presence pressing down on me, heavy and suffocating. They were moving in perfect unison, their bodies shifting with an eerie fluidity that defied human motion. They were not walking, but drifting, floating as though the very laws of physics didn't apply to them. I couldn't look away. I had tried to convince myself that this was just a dream, that if I turned around, I'd find the safety of the village waiting for me. But there was no safety. There was only the mountain, this mountain, its oppressive presence growing stronger with every moment. I was trapped in its grip, and there was no way out. The figures didn't speak. They didn't look at me directly, but their movement was deliberate, their path unyielding. It was as though they were all drawn to something. A magnetic force pulling them forward, pushing them into some inexorable descent. I watched one of them more closely, the figure closest to me, its features dimly visible through the mist. It was wearing an old, cracked helmet, its face obscured by the shadows of the fog. As it moved, its limbs seemed to stretch unnaturally long, its arms swinging in an exaggerated, mechanical motion. There was something wrong with its posture too, its back bent at an angle, as if it were not meant to stand that way. The figure's eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were two dark, empty pits, staring ahead with no focus, no awareness. There was nothing left of the person who had once been alive in that body. No fear. No hope. Just an endless, hollow drive towards something. But what? As the figure passed me, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't looking at me, but rather through me. It was as if I was invisible to it. Or perhaps I was just another part of the mountain to it, another lost soul caught in its eternal cycle. A sense of dread crept over me, sinking deeper into my bones. The figures were not moving away from me, they were moving towards something, a destination that was invisible to me but clear to them. And it was the same for all of them. They all moved in the same direction, never faltering, as though they had no will of their own. Their actions were mechanical, as if they were merely puppets being controlled by something far more powerful than their own free will. The realization struck me hard. They weren't just wandering. They were following something. A compulsion, a magnetic force drawing them down the mountain, just as it had begun to draw me. The thought sent a cold shiver down my spine. What were they following? What were they after? And then it hit me. They weren't just moving aimlessly, they were climbing down the mountain. They were heading towards something specific, something I couldn't see but felt in my gut, pulling me toward it as well. The deeper into the fog I went, the clearer the truth became. These figures weren't just victims of the mountain, they were its prisoners. They were locked in a never-ending loop, forced to descend, drawn to something below. What is it? I thought, panic rising in my chest. What is it that the mountain wants? The wind, which had been eerily silent for so long, began to pick up, a faint whispering sound in the distance. The figures didn't react to it. They kept moving, as though the mountain had whispered to them, and they were obeying its command without hesitation. My thoughts were racing now, desperately trying to piece together a puzzle I had no hope of solving. The villagers' warnings echoed in my mind. The dead walked this mountain, and I now understood the truth. These were not just people who had died. They were souls that had become trapped, bound to the mountain by some force I could not comprehend, forced to walk its path for eternity. They were trying to tell me something. I could feel it in my bones. Their path was not random, and their movements weren't mindless. They were headed towards something. And I, too, had been drawn into their descent, unwillingly following their cursed trail down the mountain. My legs trembled as I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to tear my eyes away from the procession of ghostly figures. They were too many now, stretching endlessly ahead of me, feeding into the thick fog that had swallowed everything else. There was no turning back. And as the wind howled around me, carrying with it whispers I couldn't understand, I realized just how close I was to the same fate. The mountain had claimed these lost souls, and it was claiming me as well. The fog thickened, obscuring everything beyond the first few steps in front of me. And as I stared into the ghostly procession, I knew there was no escape. Whatever the mountain wanted, I would have to face it. Just like the others. Just like the figures that walked before me. I was being led down the path towards something far darker than I could have ever imagined. And there was no turning back. Every step I took felt heavier than the last. My feet felt as if they were sinking into the very earth beneath me, the weight of the mountain pressing down on my chest with an intensity one had never experienced before. I could feel the fog thickening around me, smothering everything, until the world seemed to narrow to nothing but the oppressive presence of the figures and the unseen force that held me captive. I turned around, my mind screaming at me to run, to escape. But the path I had taken, if it could even be called a path, was no longer clear. The fog had closed in behind me, erasing the trail I had followed, turning the world into a blank canvas of gray, an endless void stretching out in every direction. I could feel my pulse quicken as I realized how completely disoriented I had become. The mountain was playing with me. It had swallowed me whole, and now I was lost, trapped in a maze with no exit, no way of knowing which way to turn. I tried to focus, to clear my mind, but the pull of the figures ahead of me was too strong, too insistent. It was as if they were calling me, silently beckoning me forward. The fear was so visceral that it twisted in my gut like a living thing. But was it fear? Or was it something else? I didn't know anymore. I took another step forward, but my legs felt like lead, as though they were no longer my own. The figures in front of me kept moving, floating down the mountain, unperturbed by my hesitation. Their movements were so calm, so determined, that they seemed to move as if they had no choice, as if they were bound by some unspoken law, a law that I was now unknowingly bound to as well. What was that sound? The whisper of the wind against the rocks. the rustling of leaves. But no, it wasn't just the wind. There was something else, something deeper, something more alive. The air itself seemed to hum with it, a low, vibrating sound that came from the very depths of the mountain. It filled my ears, drowning out the sound of my breathing, my thoughts. The whispers seemed to echo around me, circling, teasing, as if the mountain were speaking directly to me, urging me to stay on the path. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind screamed at me to leave, to run back to the village, to escape whatever it was that was happening. But my feet wouldn't move. It was as if I was glued to the ground, paralyzed by some unseen force. The figures ahead of me moved ever forward, unaware of my internal struggle, continuing their steady, emotionless descent down the mountain. Am I becoming like them? The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. The figures didn't stop. They didn't falter. They didn't question their path. They simply walked, floated toward an inevitable end, toward a place that I could never reach, never understand. And it seemed, with every passing second, that the mountain was pulling me into the same fate. Was I becoming just another lost soul? Another mindless wanderer, following the same cursed trail? I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. No. I'm still alive. I can still turn back. But something deeper inside me hesitated. The dread that had gnawed at me since I first set foot on this mountain had only grown stronger, and it now felt like a living, breathing thing inside me. A dark weight pressing against my chest, making every breath feel labored, shallow. The further I went, the heavier it became. It was suffocating. What if turning back isn't an option anymore? The idea was ludicrous. I knew it. But the longer I stood there, looking into the mist, the less certain I was. There was a primal, irrational pull urging me to stay on the path, to follow the figures, to let the mountain take me the way it had taken them. What's waiting for me down there? The question hung in the air, unanswerable. I couldn't see it. The fog was too thick. But I could feel it, that overwhelming presence just beyond my vision, just out of reach. It was calling me, like a siren song, soothing and terrifying all at once. And yet, the part of me that was still rational, still human, screamed in defiance. I wasn't going to become one of them. I wasn't going to be swallowed up by the mountain, lost in its endless cycle of death and despair. But even as I thought this, the doubt crept in. Could I even turn back now? Was there time? Was I already too far gone? Was I already a part of it? I looked over my shoulder again. The way back was obscured. The figures were still ahead of me, still descending in perfect harmony. The mountain stretched on, endless and oppressive, and I felt smaller, more insignificant with every second that passed. The fear, the dread, it wasn't just my imagination anymore. It was a force, a presence that was larger than me, larger than any individual. Is this what it feels like to be consumed by the mountain? The thought terrified me, but I couldn't shake it. And for a moment, I stood there, frozen, caught between two worlds, the one where I could still run and the one where the mountain had already claimed me. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream and break free, to tear away from this nightmare. But the air, the silence, the cold, they were all pressing against me, weighing me down until I couldn't move. The figures kept descending, ever closer, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. I turned my head forward again. The figures were nearing, the shadowy procession growing clearer, almost tangible. They were real. They were here. And somehow, I knew they would never leave me. They were part of the mountain. And now I was, too. In the silence of the fog, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a soft, faint whisper. A voice that wasn't my own. Come with us. It was not a command. It was an invitation. A promise of something far worse than death. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to take another step toward those figures, toward that cursed path. But my body, it seemed, had made its decision. My legs began to move on their own, as if the mountain itself had reached into me, taking control, urging me forward. I tried to stop. I dug my heels into the soft, wet earth beneath me, willing my body to freeze, to disobey the invisible force that was pulling me closer to the figures. But it was futile. My feet slid forward, one step after another, as though they were being guided by some invisible hand, dragging me deeper into the mountain's suffocating grip. The figures, those ghostly apparitions, continued their descent, each of them gliding down the mountain without a sound. The wind had picked up, and the fog seemed to thicken, twisting and curling around the figures like smoke, obscuring their shapes, but always pulling them forward. They were like shadows, detached from the world of the living, drawn by some magnetic force. But what were they drawn to? What is it? I didn't know, but I could feel it, the same pull they were experiencing. It was inside me, inside my chest, like a strange compulsion that pushed me to follow, to keep walking despite every rational part of me screaming to turn back. My heart hammered in my chest, my breath shallow and uneven. I couldn't stop. I had lost control. It was as if my body had become a puppet, its strings pulled by the mountain itself. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the village in the distance, but the fog had closed in around me like a wall. There was nothing but the oppressive silence of the mountain and the eerie procession of figures moving ahead. I looked back at them, my eyes widening as I saw their forms shift in the mist. They moved with purpose, each step taken in perfect synchronization, like a macabre dance. Their limbs didn't seem to touch the ground as they floated down, their heads slightly tilted as if listening to some faint sound in the distance, some unspoken call. I felt my pulse quicken, my senses becoming sharper, more alert. The figures, were they aware of me now? The thought chilled me. I didn't dare slow down. I had no choice but to keep moving, my mind swirling with panic and confusion. I looked ahead again. The mountain loomed higher now, the mist growing thicker, more oppressive with every step I took. It felt as though I was moving deeper into something that was slowly swallowing me whole, like a great beast with an insatiable hunger. The figures were still leading the way, oblivious to my presence, or maybe indifferent to it. They didn't seem to notice that I was now part of their procession, walking in step with them, as though I belonged here, too. The air felt colder, sharper now. The silence had turned suffocating, but it wasn't just the absence of sound, it was as if the very space around me was alive, holding its breath, waiting. Suddenly, I felt a shift in the air, a subtle, unnerving change in the atmosphere. The figures ahead of me moved faster now, their pace quickening in an almost mechanical way. My own footsteps began to match their rhythm, as if my body was no longer just following them, but chasing them. No! I tried to fight it, but it was as if the mountain had taken root inside me, digging into my very bones, forcing my will to bend. My legs began to move with increasing urgency, following the figure's every step. I tried to stop, tried to dig my hands into the ground, to grip anything that would slow me down, but it was useless. I had become part of the chase. There was no escaping it. The figures ahead didn't slow, their ghostly forms melting with the mist, becoming indistinguishable from the fog itself. Yet, despite their unearthly stillness, there was a subtle urgency in the way they moved now. Their purpose was clear. They were heading towards something. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, like an invisible force tugging at the edges of my consciousness, pulling me toward the same destination. What is it? The question echoed in my mind like a drumbeat, but no answer came. The fog grew thicker, and the air, once cold, now had an unnatural chill to it, sinking into my skin, into my very soul. The mountain felt like it was breathing, exhaling its chill through the mist, its whispers curling around me, guiding me forward. But what was I running toward? What was at the end of this path? Was it death? Or something worse? I could barely hear my own thoughts over the pounding of my heart, the steady thrum of fear in my ears. The figures ahead were becoming more indistinct now, their outlines lost in the fog, but I knew, I could feel it, that I was getting closer. Closer to whatever they were heading toward. Closer to whatever the mountain wanted me to find. I took another step, my legs moving on their own, my breath caught in my throat. I don't want this. But it didn't matter. The chase had begun, and I was no longer in control. Every step I took drew me closer to the end, closer to the mystery that had haunted this mountain for so long. Whatever it was that had drawn the figures here, whatever it was that had lured me into this descent, it was waiting for me. And there was no turning back. The air had grown heavier with each step. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the weight of the mountain pressing down on me as I followed those figures. But now, as I walked, I could feel it, something was wrong. The path beneath my feet felt uneven, almost alive, shifting subtly as I moved. What had once been a steady incline was now treacherous, as though the mountain itself was slowly warping, changing to hinder my every step. I tried to steady myself, squinting through the thickening fog, but the landscape had begun to lose its form, the jagged rocks and craggy edges blurring into one continuous gray mass. The shapes around me were morphing, unrecognizable, as if the mountain was trying to disorient me, to swallow me whole. I reached out for a rock to steady myself, but the moment my hand brushed against it, the stone seemed to shift, moving away from my touch like it was something living. I recoiled, my heart racing in my chest. It can't be. The ground beneath me felt less solid now, more unstable. My boots sunk deeper into the soft earth with each step, as if the mountain itself were shifting, drawing me deeper into its depths. The trees, if they could even be called that, appeared to be bending toward me, their twisted trunks leaning in, their branches extending as if they were reaching for me. I took a step back, unsure which direction I had even come from. The path was no longer clear. The air was thick, suffocating, and the further I went, the more it felt like the mountain was closing in, constricting, suffocating. This isn't right. I glanced behind me, but the fog had obscured everything. The figures were gone, swallowed up by the mist, their forms now just fleeting memories in the corners of my mind. I couldn't hear their footsteps anymore, couldn't see them moving ahead, as if they had evaporated into the very air. I tried to breathe, but the air felt thinner, harder to draw in. It was as though the mountain itself was absorbing the life from me, leaving me hollow, breathless, lost. I couldn't even trust the ground beneath me. It seemed to shift with every movement, never remaining the same for long. Every step I took felt more like a misstep, my footing unsure, my path unrecognizable. There was a low, distant rumble, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't the wind. It was something else, something more deliberate, more alive. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The mountain was moving. The mountain is alive. I could feel it. The ground seemed to pulse beneath me, a steady, rhythmic beat. The rock around me was no longer still, no longer lifeless. It was alive, breathing, shifting. And I was at its mercy. I tried to focus, tried to remember the path I had come from, but everything was different now. The terrain had changed. What was once a sharp incline had become a gentle slope, but one that led nowhere. The fog twisted around me in spirals. The trees, if they were trees at all, bent in strange, unnatural angles, as if watching me. I turned again, searching for any sign of where the figures might have gone. But there was nothing. The mountain had erased them. Or maybe they had never been there to begin with. I need to get out. I need to leave. But the thought was useless. There was no way back. The landscape had conspired against me. The mountain had claimed me, and I was being led deeper into its trap with every step. My legs were moving again, even though I hadn't willed them to. My body was no longer my own. It was as if the mountain was taking control, urging me forward, deeper into its embrace. I could feel it now, a deep, gnawing sensation in my chest, the growing pressure of being drawn into something I couldn't understand, something I couldn't escape. Every instinct I had screamed for me to stop, to resist. But it was too late. I was already part of it. The fog closed in tighter, the walls of the mountain shifting, warping, until there was no longer any distinction between the sky and the earth. I was surrounded by nothing but gray, an endless expanse of mist and stone, pressing in from all sides. I couldn't hear anything anymore, not the wind, not the trees, not the footsteps I had been following. It was just silence. The oppressive, suffocating silence of the mountain. And then, the ground beneath me trembled. It was subtle at first, just a slight vibration, like the earth had taken a deep, slow breath. But as the tremor grew, I felt the ground beneath me shift, slide, as though the mountain itself was preparing to swallow me whole. My heart raced, panic rising in my chest. I tried to take a step, but my foot caught on something. No, not something. Someone. I gasped, looking down. A hand. A pale, outstretched hand was reaching up from the earth. It was covered in dirt and grime, its fingers unnaturally long and twisted, but there was no mistaking it. It was human. A body, half buried in the soil, clawing its way out of the mountain, trying to drag itself free. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't alone. There were more. Figures, shadows, emerged from the ground around me, their faces contorted in silent screams, their limbs twisted in unnatural ways. They were all reaching for me, their hands grasping at my feet, pulling me toward the depths of the earth. I stumbled backward, tripping over a rock, but the figures kept coming, crawling from the earth, their eyes wide with terror and longing. The mountain was claiming them. And now, it was claiming me. The rumble grew louder, the mountain's heartbeat thundering beneath me. I tried to move, but my body refused to obey. The figures had closed in on me now, their cold hands wrapping around my legs, pulling me down, dragging me closer to the ground. Their skin was cold and damp, their touch unrelenting, and I could feel their despair, their endless hunger reaching into me, drowning me in their desperation. This is it. I was part of the trap now. The mountain had claimed me. There was no escape. The earth began to shift beneath me, and I was falling deeper into the mountain's embrace. Into the dark, suffocating void where nothing escaped. And I realized, too late, that I wasn't following the figures. They were following me. The ground trembled beneath me, the rumble still vibrating through my bones. The figures, those strange, elusive climbers, were just ahead now, or at least I thought they were. In the thickening fog, their movements were like shadows, flickering at the very edge of my vision, always just out of reach. I had to get closer. I had to understand. They were the key. I pushed forward, each step a struggle against the mounting dread gnawing at my chest. The weight of the mountain pressed down on me, the air growing colder, heavier, until it felt like I was wading through a fog of pure ice. My breath came out in shallow gasps, the mist swallowing it whole, leaving me feeling lightheaded and disoriented. And then, I saw them. At first, I thought it was an illusion, the fog playing tricks on me, but no. I saw them clearly now, 3 figures, their outlines jagged and unnatural against the gray of the mountain. They were moving slowly, their feet gliding over the path in a way that seemed wrong. No crunch of rocks beneath their boots, no rustling of leaves as they passed. They simply floated, their forms hazy and indistinct in the mist. My heart skipped a beat. They're here. I had caught up with them. I stumbled forward, my legs shaking, my mind racing. I couldn't let them get away. They were my only chance to understand this madness, to find out what the mountain wanted. Maybe they had answers. Maybe they want me to follow. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. But I couldn't stop now. I had to reach them. With every step, the figures came into clearer focus. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as if they were on a path that only they could see. The closer I got, the more unsettling it became. Their faces were hidden, cloaked in shadows, but I could feel their eyes on me. Or maybe it was just the weight of the mountain, the sensation of being watched, but it was as though they were aware of my every move. I was so close now, just a few feet away, and I could hear them. A soft, faint whisper, like the rustling of dry leaves, the murmur of wind, or perhaps a voice calling from far, far away. It was almost a sound that echoed in my ears, repeating itself like a forgotten lullaby. The figures kept moving down the mountain, not looking back, but still leading me forward. Stay with them. Keep going. I pressed on, my hands trembling as I reached out toward one of them. My fingertips brushed against the air where one of them should have been, but there was nothing there. I stopped. My breath caught in my throat. What just happened? I looked around frantically, my heart racing, my pulse thudding in my ears. The figures were gone. Just like that. Disappeared. One moment they had been right in front of me, and now, nothing. The path was empty, save for the swirling mist that had closed in like a curtain, masking everything in gray. This isn't real. I spun in a circle, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The mountain had done this. It was twisting reality. The path, the fog, the figures, nothing was what it seemed. But the trail, it had to be there. I had to find them again. They had to be just ahead. They were leading me somewhere. They were the answer. I forced myself to keep walking, my legs heavy, my mind swirling. Each step felt harder than the last, the ground beneath me shifting and pulling at my every movement. The fog thickened, swirling around me, making the world feel like it was shrinking with each passing moment. I reached a clearing in the path, a place where the trees had thinned out and the rocks jutted up, sharp and jagged, like teeth waiting to bite. It was here that I had seen them. It was here that I had felt them, just out of reach, their shadows gliding ahead. But now, there was nothing. I stood there, breathing heavily, trying to listen for any sound, any trace of their presence. But there was nothing, just the echo of my own breath, the silence pressing in around me. What the hell is going on? I felt it then. A shift. A tremor in the air. The mountain was watching me. Waiting. The figures might have been gone, but something else was here now, something far worse. The silence grew heavier, more oppressive, and my heart pounded louder in my chest. I turned around, my eyes scanning the fog, hoping for any sign of movement. But it was too late. The whispering began again. Soft at first, like the rustling of wind through the trees, but it grew louder, more distinct. The figures were there, just beyond the mist. I could see them now, or at least, I thought I could. Their forms were like shadows, flickering and warping, always just out of reach. Their faces were still hidden, but they were closer now. They were waiting for me to follow. I took a step forward, my legs shaking, my breath ragged. And then they moved. It was like the fog itself had come alive, shifting, swirling, as if the mountain had exhaled a breath. The figures glided effortlessly down the path again, as if I had never been there at all, as if they hadn't just vanished a moment ago. They were leading me again, like ghosts leading the lost souls of the mountain. And I had no choice but to follow. The mountain was still, unnervingly so. The wind had died down, and the soft hiss of the fog was the only sound that filled the air. But as I moved deeper into the path, pushing forward against the weight of the silence, something began to change. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, a chill creeping over me that had nothing to do with the cold air. It was as though the very atmosphere had shifted, turning colder, heavier. My breath fogged in front of me, but it wasn't just the cold. It was something else, something far more unsettling. I'm not alone. I paused, my feet coming to an unsteady stop. My heartbeat quickened, hammering in my chest. For a moment, there was nothing but the eerie quiet of the mountain, the distant whisper of the fog curling around me. Then, faint but unmistakable, I heard it. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate steps. Not from the figures ahead of me, but from behind. I spun around, my pulse spiking, my breath caught in my throat. But the fog had closed in again, thick and swirling, hiding the trail behind me. There was nothing. No one. Just the fog and the dark, empty path I had just walked. It must be my mind playing tricks on me. I tried to shake it off, to convince myself it was just the wind or the mountains themselves settling, but the footsteps continued. Slow. Measured. As if someone was walking directly behind me, shadowing my every move. My heart raced, the rhythm of the footsteps matching my own, getting louder, closer with each step. I quickened my pace, but the sound didn't change. Whoever, or whatever, was behind me was keeping the exact same pace, just a few feet away, trailing my every step. I dared not turn around again, the feeling of being followed gnawing at my spine, sending a tremor through my body. The silence had returned, but that unnatural weight, the footsteps, still clung to me, lurking just beyond the edge of my hearing. Then, I felt it. A cold breath, brushing against the back of my neck. It wasn't wind. It was too direct, too purposeful. A shiver ran down my spine as the temperature seemed to drop even further. The breath, no, the presence, was right there, hovering just behind me. I froze. My body went rigid, every muscle screaming at me to move, to run, to escape whatever it was that was so close I could almost feel it. But I couldn't. I couldn't even breathe. The pressure on my chest was suffocating, and all I could hear was that quiet, deliberate breathing, almost as though someone was whispering my name just behind me. I didn't dare turn my head, didn't dare look over my shoulder. I had no idea what would be there if I did. But I could feel it, its presence, its gaze. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was still again, as if the mountain itself held its breath. Is it waiting for me to move? The tension was unbearable, like a thick fog pressing against my skin, suffocating me from all sides. I couldn't even hear my own heartbeat anymore, just the cold whisper of air on my neck, the chill that was becoming unbearable. And then, just as I thought I might snap from the sheer terror, it came. A voice. Soft. Faint. It wasn't a whisper exactly, but more like a murmur, almost imperceptible. Follow. The word wasn't spoken with malice, but with an undeniable sense of command. A pull. A tug on my very soul that made my feet move forward, against my will, despite the fear that was crushing me from the inside out. It wasn't a request. It was a command, and I found myself unable to resist. My legs, trembling from the strain of the fear and the cold, began to move again. One step, then another. I couldn't stop myself. The fog seemed to close in tighter, the mountain pressing around me like an inescapable maze. The footsteps behind me resumed, matching my pace, but now they were joined by something else. A whisper. An almost imperceptible murmur, just loud enough to be heard if I focused, but faint enough to send chills through my spine. It wasn't just the footsteps anymore. It was the breathing, the words. The presence was growing. Closer. I had to fight it. I had to resist. But I couldn't. As I walked, I could feel the coldness creeping into my bones, seeping into my thoughts. The mountain was speaking to me now. The footsteps, the breath, they weren't just chasing me. They were guiding me. They were pushing me forward, drawing me deeper into the trap. I could hear the figures again, ahead of me. Their shadowy forms danced in and out of view, always moving, always just a step ahead, as though they were waiting for me to catch up. The question gnawed at me, louder now than ever before. What do they want? The answer, perhaps, was simple. They wanted me to follow. And if I did, would I ever return? The fog seemed to grow thicker with each step, wrapping itself around me like an invisible hand, pulling me deeper into the mountain's grip. The air was colder now, so cold that it stung with every breath. My fingers were numb, my legs aching, and my mind was fraying at the edges. I had to keep moving. I had to keep following the path, following the figures ahead of me, even though every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run, to escape the madness that had consumed me. But there was something inside me, something dark and persistent, urging me forward. The figures, those shadowy climbers, they were calling to me, beckoning me to join them. Join them? I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts that were swirling in my mind, like leaves caught in a storm. I could barely tell where the path ended and where the fog began. The world felt like it was shifting, warping, slipping out of focus. The line between reality and nightmare was thinning, and I couldn't hold on to either. The whispers were louder now. Low, guttural murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They were not words, no, not exactly, but the tone, the rhythm, was unmistakable. It was as if the mountain itself was speaking to me, urging me to surrender, to lose myself in the fog, to give in to the lure of the shadows. I'm losing my mind. I stopped walking, my chest heaving as I gasped for air. The fog pressed in on me from all sides, its damp fingers wrapping around my throat, choking the breath from my lungs. I tried to steady myself, tried to focus, but my vision kept blurring, the figures ahead of me twisting and shifting in the mist. One moment they were there, just a few feet away, and the next, they had vanished, replaced by shadows that danced and flickered at the edge of my perception. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I reached for the rocks beside the path, my fingers trembling as I tried to ground myself. Focus. Focus. Keep your mind straight. But the fog seemed to get thicker, the shadows darker, and the whispers, they kept coming. I was no longer sure if they were in my head or if they were real, if the figures were truly there or if I was seeing things that weren't even real. I felt the ground beneath me shift, the earth trembling as if the mountain itself were alive, breathing, alive with hunger. The cold bite of the air began to burn my skin, like ice pricking at my nerves. My breath came out in jagged gasps, but no matter how hard I tried to focus on each breath, it felt as if the world around me was spinning faster than I could keep up. What's happening? I stumbled, my legs weak beneath me, the ground tilting unnaturally beneath my feet. The path seemed to curve and twist in impossible directions, like a labyrinth that was constantly shifting, leading me further and further into the unknown. The figures, they were still there, always ahead, always just a step beyond reach, drawing me into the dark. I felt something behind me. I turned quickly, but there was nothing but the endless fog that swallowed the path, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The sounds were still there, though. The faintest whisper, like a breath against my ear, like footsteps just behind me. I could feel them, feel their presence, like an invisible weight pressing down on me. Am I losing my mind? The question echoed in my head, louder than the whispers. The fear, the isolation, was warping everything. It was impossible to tell what was real anymore. The mountain, the fog, the figures, were they all part of some twisted illusion, a trick of my mind, or was this really happening? I couldn't tell. I didn't know anymore. I reached out, desperate to anchor myself to something solid, anything real. My hand brushed against the rock wall beside the path, its rough surface grounding me for a brief moment. But even as I touched it, I felt a tremor run through the mountain itself, a low rumble that seemed to come from deep within, like the mountain was alive, like it was watching me. The fog thickened again, swirling around me like a living thing, and I realized, with a sickening jolt, that I could no longer hear the figures in front of me. They had gone quiet. Too quiet. No, I can't be alone. Not again. I whirled around, my heart in my throat, my body trembling with fear. My breath was coming in sharp, panicked gasps. The fog swirled and shifted, but there was nothing. No figures. No footsteps. No whispers. Just silence. I was standing in the middle of the path, my body trembling uncontrollably, the fear tightening its grip on me like a vice. I had no idea how much time had passed, how long I had been walking, or if I was even on the same path anymore. Had I walked in a circle? I turned in a slow, agonizing circle, my eyes darting desperately for any sign of the figures, for any hint of where I should go next. The mountain, it was closing in around me. The fog was a suffocating blanket. The air was too thick, too heavy. The whispers had become too loud to ignore, filling my ears, my mind, my soul. I could feel the pressure of them, pulling at me, dragging me deeper into the madness. I can't stay here. I had to escape. I had to find a way out, but I didn't know where the path was anymore. I didn't know what was real. And then I heard it again. Footsteps. But this time, they weren't behind me. They were in front of me. And the figures, the ones who had been leading me all along, had returned. They had never left. They were always with me, watching, waiting. And I couldn't outrun them. My head was spinning. The fog, the whispers, the figures, it all blurred together in a chaotic storm inside my mind. The mountain felt like it was alive, breathing around me, and every step I took seemed to pull me further away from sanity. I could no longer trust what I saw or heard. Was I really walking forward, or had I been circling in the same spot for hours? The pressure in my chest grew heavier, tighter, as if the mountain itself was pushing down on me, trying to suffocate me. I felt like a pawn in a twisted game, being toyed with by something far beyond my understanding. I need to get out. I need to find a way out. That thought clung to me like a lifeline. Escape. But how? The figures, those ghostly climbers, had drawn me deeper into their web, and now I could see nothing but the fog and the dark shadows that danced at the edges of my vision. There was no clear path anymore, no way back. Every direction seemed to lead me further into the abyss, and my mind was starting to fray at the seams. I had to make a choice. But was it even my choice anymore? My body moved before my mind could catch up. My feet carried me toward a narrow trail that snaked its way between jagged rocks, a dark passageway that seemed to promise something that I couldn't quite grasp. The figures ahead of me had disappeared once more, but I knew they were close. I could feel them. The trail was faint, barely discernible through the fog, but it seemed like the only option. The path I had been following was gone, swallowed by the mist. The only thing that remained was this narrow route leading further into the mountain. It's the only way. I told myself that. I had no other choice. The thought of turning back, retracing my steps, was too terrifying. It felt like the mountain itself would collapse if I even tried to go back. The figures might be waiting for me, or worse, they might be behind me already. Without thinking, I pushed forward, stepping onto the narrow trail. It was cramped, the rocks pressing in on both sides, and I had to duck low at times to avoid sharp boulders that jutted out from the walls. The fog was thick here, almost choking, and the air seemed to press down on me more with each passing moment. But I kept going, step by step, the whispering voices in my mind urging me onward. I wasn't sure how long I had been walking, but I felt an overwhelming sense of urgency, as if something was about to happen. Something terrible. The silence between the whispers was almost deafening. I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore, but I felt them, like a weight on my chest, heavy and suffocating. And then I heard it. A faint sound, like a rock scraping against another. I stopped, my heart skipping a beat. The noise had come from ahead. It wasn't the soft, steady rhythm of the ghostly climbers, but something sharper, more distinct. Something moving. Something alive? My body froze. It's a trap. The realization hit me like a wave, crashing over me with such force that I staggered back. This narrow trail, this was where they wanted me to go. It was where the mountain wanted me to go. My instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run, but I couldn't. The fog had thickened even more, closing in from all sides, making the way back impossible. I was trapped. I took a hesitant step forward, my breath shallow, as the shadows seemed to grow taller, looming over me like specters waiting for the right moment to strike. The narrow trail twisted ahead, descending into a deeper section of the mountain. And that sound, it came again, louder now, closer. A scraping sound, followed by a faint, almost inaudible whisper. "Follow us." I tried to push the words out of my mind. I couldn't follow them. I wouldn't. But I felt my feet move again, against my will. The pull was too strong. The mountain was pulling me, dragging me down its dark path. I had no choice but to follow. The figures, whether they were real or imagined, were ahead of me again, just out of sight, leading me deeper into the mountain's heart. The path narrowed even further, the rocks growing jagged and treacherous. I could feel the weight of the mountain pressing in on me, the walls closing in. I had to be careful. One wrong step, and I would fall. The air was growing colder, thinner, and the fog was so thick now that I could barely see the trail ahead. I heard the sound again, but this time it wasn't from the front. It was from below. My heart pounded as I realized what had happened too late. The path had turned into a precarious ledge, and the narrow trail I was following dropped off sharply on either side into an abyss. I hadn't noticed. I was too focused on the figures, too consumed by the whispers. I looked down, my legs trembling, and the ground seemed to shift beneath me. The ledge was crumbling, jagged, barely wide enough to keep my footing. One misstep, just one, would send me plummeting into the darkness below. The scraping sound came again, louder this time, followed by another whisper. The figures were right behind me now, too close. Their presence was suffocating, overwhelming. I could feel them, their cold breath on my neck, the weight of their gaze on my back. I can't do this. I can't stay here. I took another step, my foot sliding on the loose rocks beneath me, and before I could react, the ground gave way. My stomach lurched as I lost my balance, my arms flailing desperately for anything to grab onto. The darkness swallowed me whole. I felt myself falling, the rush of air around me deafening, the screams of the mountain echoing in my ears. Then, everything went black. I woke to darkness. A cold that sank deep into my bones, and a weight, something heavy, like the mountain itself, was sitting on my chest. The world around me was muffled, distorted, as if I were submerged in water, unable to escape the suffocating pressure. I gasped, my breath coming in shallow, frantic bursts, but the air was thin. Too thin. My lungs burned, desperate for more, but there was nothing to take in. The mountain felt alive beneath me, pulsating with a deep, resonant hum, like it was breathing, like it was watching me. The ground I lay on was hard, uneven, and I could feel its jagged edges pressing into my back. Every breath felt like I was suffocating, but still, the grip of the mountain tightened around me, pulling me deeper into its depths. I opened my eyes, but it was like trying to focus in the midst of a storm. The darkness was oppressive, almost tangible, suffocating my every movement. I couldn't see the path I had fallen from, couldn't see anything beyond the black void that surrounded me. Where am I? The questions rose in my mind, but they felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. I couldn't tell how much time had passed. Minutes? Hours? Days? The feeling of being trapped, stuck between the world of the living and something else, began to gnaw at my sanity. Was I even still alive? Or had the mountain already claimed me? Was I simply a part of its darkness now? I forced myself to sit up, my head spinning, nausea rising in my stomach as the fog seemed to cling to my skin, thickening the air around me. It felt wrong, unnatural. The ground beneath me was soft, like wet earth, but the air? It was too still, too quiet. The kind of silence that presses down on you, weighs you down like a physical presence. The sky was too close. I looked up, my eyes straining to make sense of it. The clouds, they were moving in strange patterns, shifting and swirling as if they were alive. The pale light filtering through the thick, rolling mist gave the scene an eerie glow. The sky didn't feel like the sky. It felt alien. The edges of the clouds, jagged and unnatural, seemed to scrape against the mountain's jagged peaks, reaching down toward me like they were closing in. I'm not supposed to be here. The thought slammed into me, sharp and sudden. My chest tightened as a deep, gnawing fear spread through me. I had been here before, or had I? The weight of the mountain, the oppressive air, the strange feeling of being drawn into something beyond comprehension, it all felt wrong, so wrong. I couldn't shake the sense that this place wasn't just a part of the earth. No. This mountain, this was something else. I tried to rise, but my body felt sluggish, heavy, as though the very mountain had drained the energy from my limbs. My legs quivered beneath me as I pushed myself upright, but the pressure of the air, the weight of the atmosphere, it was suffocating, pulling me back down. And then I heard it. A low rumble. At first, it was barely audible, just a vibration beneath my feet. But then it grew louder, a deep growl that rumbled through the mountain itself, reverberating through my chest. It felt as though the mountain was speaking, its voice low and guttural, shaking the earth. The sound was followed by a shudder in the air, like a violent tremor had shaken the very fabric of the world. The fog shifted, swirling faster, and I caught sight of someone moving in the distance. A figure. One of them. The ghostly climbers, their forms barely visible, shimmering like shadows, moving in slow, deliberate steps. The cold breath of the mountain swept over me, and I realized I was being drawn toward them. It wasn't just a figure. It was them. The climbers. They were waiting for me. I tried to move, to flee, but the weight of the mountain had me in its grip. My legs were locked in place, my feet unable to move, as though the earth itself had become part of my skin. The air grew colder still, freezing my breath, and I felt the mountains pulse beneath me, rhythmic, like a heartbeat, slow, steady, relentless. The sky, too, was closing in. The clouds, low and dark, seemed to press against the mountain's jagged surface, pulling the very air toward them, suffocating the world beneath. The whispers, they were louder now, clearer, like voices from a distance, calling me, beckoning me forward. I couldn't turn back. I couldn't escape. My chest tightened with a visceral sense of panic. My body screamed to run, to escape, but my mind was tangled in the mountain's grip, the fog, the figures. I could feel them now, all around me, pulling me toward their realm, their world, where time and reality no longer made sense. The figures, they had drawn me here, and I had followed them without question, without realizing what it meant. The ground beneath me trembled again, and the sky seemed to stretch and bend, warping the horizon in a way that shouldn't have been possible. I reached out, desperate to cling to something, anything, but my hands grasped at empty air. The mountain was swallowing me whole, its grip tightening with every breath I took, pulling me deeper, deeper into its strange, twisted realm. And I realized with growing horror, I wasn't going to escape. I was becoming part of the mountain, part of its darkness. And the sky, that heavy, suffocating sky, was about to consume me entirely. The weight of the air around me thickened, pressing in from all sides, until it felt as if the very atmosphere itself were suffocating me. I couldn't breathe properly. Every inhale was a struggle, each breath more desperate than the last. The pulse of the mountain beneath me had become a constant thrum, reverberating through my entire being as if it had taken root inside my chest. And then I saw them. The figures. The ghostly climbers I had been following, or had they been following me, emerged once more, but this time they weren't alone. The shadows twisted and writhed, as if something far darker was lurking within them, pulling the light away from the world. There was a sickening distortion in the air, a ripple, as though reality itself was warping, bending to the will of something ancient, something malevolent. One of the climbers stopped, its form shimmering like a mirage, barely tangible, and turned toward me. I could see its face, or what was left of it, its features blurred, as though melted or eroded by time. But then, the face snapped into focus. And it was screaming. Not with sound, no, the scream came from its eyes, from the gaping mouth, twisted in terror, as though it were trapped in an eternal moment of agony. The figure reached out toward me, its hands stretching unnaturally, fingers long and jagged like claws, beckoning me forward with a silent, terrible urgency. But it wasn't just one figure. All around me, more appeared, out of the mist, emerging from the very shadows themselves. At first, I thought I saw nothing but darkness, but then I realized they were there. Faces. Eyes. Hands. Twisted, gnarled, and pale, as though they had been pulled from the very fabric of the earth itself. The faces were contorted in silent screams, their mouths open wide, but no sound escaped them. They reached toward me with desperate hands, like they were trapped in the same cycle as the ghostly climbers. They weren't calling me, they were begging me. Please, don't come closer. But there was no time to hesitate. The fog thickened, swirling around me faster, and the figures grew more solid, their forms becoming more defined. The climbers, their once distant presence now oppressive and near, stepped toward me with a slow, deliberate pace, their movements unnaturally smooth. The faces, those faces, all merged together in the periphery of my vision, like a silent wave of dread washing over me, each face a reflection of terror that made my heart stop cold. They were waiting. For me. I couldn't tell where one figure ended and the next began, but I could feel the cold of their touch, the chill that washed over me, like fingers grazing my skin, icy and unyielding. My hands trembled as I clutched my chest, as if trying to keep my heart from breaking free. I felt their presence, not with my eyes, but in every fiber of my being. Their hands, their faces, they were reaching for me, drawing me in. They want me to join them. I stumbled backward, my legs weak, the earth beneath me shifting as if the mountain itself was tilting, urging me toward them. The twisted faces around me stretched further, mouths gaping wider, eyes growing darker, but I couldn't turn away. It was as though something was forcing me to watch, forcing me to feel their pain. I wanted to scream, to run, but the words caught in my throat. The mountain pressed closer, and the figures, the souls, they were all around me now, surrounding me. Their eyes burned with an agony that seemed endless, as if they had been trapped here for eternity, doomed to repeat their suffering, forever tethered to the mountain, never able to escape. A sudden rush of wind swept through the mist, sending a shiver down my spine. It carried with it a whisper, a low, croaking voice that seemed to come from all directions at once. It was a voice I recognized, but I couldn't place it. Join us. The words echoed in my mind, making my skin crawling up my spine like ice. The faces twisted further, stretching impossibly wide, as though they were trying to pull me into the depths of their nightmare. I saw one face that seemed so familiar, so much like mine, that it nearly broke me. It was a reflection of what I might become if I stayed here too long, if I let myself be consumed by this place. The figures stretched toward me, their arms lengthening unnaturally, their fingers reaching with a desperate hunger. The cold air around me thickened, turning frigid, and the world began to spin. My body felt as if it were sinking into the earth, as if the ground beneath me had become quicksand, pulling me down into the darkness. I couldn't run. I couldn't fight them. The figures were too many, too powerful. They were closing in, their movements too fast for me to escape, their hands like iron around my throat, pulling me toward their endless suffering. And the whisper, "Join us," repeated over and over, each word more suffocating than the last. I was losing myself. The mountain had already claimed me. The faces, the figures, they were me. I was becoming them. And just as I thought I couldn't breathe anymore, as I felt myself being pulled into the depths, the world around me suddenly shattered. The mountain's grip loosened. The fog cleared. The faces vanished. And for a moment, I thought I was free. The world around me spun wildly, each turn a dizzying blur of shadow and mist. I stumbled, my legs barely holding me up, but I couldn't stop myself from moving. I could feel it, the mountain's call, louder now, more insistent than before. The air was suffocating, cold and sharp, biting at my skin. It felt like I was sinking, like the very ground beneath me was pulling me into its depths, dragging me closer to whatever nightmare the mountain was hiding. I shook my head violently, trying to clear the fog that seemed to cloud my thoughts. I couldn't think straight. My heart pounded in my chest, the rapid thumping a constant reminder of the growing terror gnawing at me from within. The faces, those twisted, agonized faces, still lingered at the edges of my vision, their hollow eyes staring, watching, waiting for me to make the fatal choice. They wanted me. No. I will not be like them. I gritted my teeth and tried to push forward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Every step felt like it took more effort than the last. The mountain was toying with me. It wanted me to fall, to give in. I had seen it in the faces, those who had come before, who had walked the same path, who had followed the call, just as I had been tempted to do. They were lost, trapped. I could feel my mind unraveling, the pull of the mountain seeping deeper into my bones, whispering promises of endless peace, of escape from the torment of the living. I wanted to give in. I wanted to rest, to stop struggling. The mountain promised it would be over. But then, I remembered the faces. The people whose eyes I had met, those who had been drawn into the same abyss. They weren't at peace. They were suffering, their mouths open in screams that would never end. They had become part of the mountain, part of its curse. I wasn't like them. I wouldn't be. I took a deep breath, forcing my trembling hands to steady. I could feel the mountain shifting beneath me, the air becoming thick with the pressure of it, as if it was waiting for me to succumb. The shadows seemed to move with a mind of their own, the edges of the mist blurring as the figures from before flickered at the corners of my vision, their cold fingers brushing my skin, trying to pull me in. Stay focused. I repeated the thought over and over in my mind, trying to anchor myself to something solid, something real. I couldn't let go. I couldn't let this mountain swallow me whole, like it had so many others. I had to keep moving, even though every part of me screamed for me to stop. I forced my legs to move, each step a battle against the pull of the mountain, against the creeping darkness that wanted to claim me. The fog pressed in, the faces in the mist growing clearer, more insistent, their twisted mouths contorting into forms of desperate, silent pleas. You belong here. Come to us. The voice wasn't spoken aloud, but it echoed in my mind, cold and unforgiving. It felt like my own thoughts, but it was wrong. It was the mountain's voice, its call, pulling me deeper into its grip. My head throbbed with the pressure, the force of the whispers tearing at my resolve. I stumbled again, my foot catching on a rock hidden beneath the mist, but I caught myself before I could fall. My hands were shaking now, my chest tight with panic, but I had to keep going. There was no turning back. I couldn't let them win. I heard the faint sound of movement behind me, shuffling footsteps, too light and too fast to be human. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there. Only the swirling mist, the oppressive silence pressing in on me once again. My eyes darted through the darkness, searching for something, anything, that could prove I wasn't completely alone. But there was no sign of the figures. No sign of anyone. Just the deep, relentless hum of the mountain pulsing in the ground beneath my feet. I could feel the pull again. Stronger this time. It wrapped around me like a tightening coil, a cold hand clutching at my chest, dragging me towards something I couldn't see, something that made the very air feel like ice in my lungs. My legs felt weak again, my body screaming to rest, to give up. But I couldn't. I refused to. I forced myself to keep walking. The mountain wasn't going to have me. Not yet. But the deeper I went, the more I realized something horrible. The mountain wasn't just pulling me toward it, it was changing me. My thoughts grew clouded, my senses dulled, as though my mind was being drawn into the same fog that consumed the world around me. I could feel it, the grip of the mountain, tightening around me like a vice, slowly, deliberately. I couldn't keep this up much longer. The air was thinner now, harder to breathe, and the voices, those haunting, faceless voices, grew louder with every step I took. The figures, too, were closer now, moving faster, their cold, empty eyes boring into me. I didn't know how much longer I could resist. The urge to follow them was growing stronger, a sickening, magnetic pull that I couldn't ignore. I wanted to give in, but I wouldn't. I had to fight it. I had to hold on to whatever part of myself still remained. Keep moving. It was the only thought I could hold on to. The only thing keeping me from slipping into the abyss. And so, I forced myself to keep going, even though every part of me wanted to stop. Even though every instinct screamed at me to turn and join the others, to give in to the pull, to let the mountain swallow me whole. But I didn't. I couldn't. The mountain seemed to close in on me from all sides, the fog now a suffocating blanket that swallowed the world whole. My breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale a struggle, and every inhaled breath felt colder than the last. The pressure in my chest was unbearable, as if someone, was sitting on my ribs, forcing the air from my lungs. My legs were weak, my mind clouded, but I couldn't stop moving. And then, just as I was about to lose myself to the fog and the despair creeping into my thoughts, I saw them. A flash. A momentary flicker of movement. It was brief, just a split second, but it was enough. A figure, walking ahead of me, their form partially obscured by the thick mist. At first, I thought it was one of the ghostly climbers, one of the figures who had been leading me further into the mountain's grasp. But this one was different. It looked real, like a living, breathing person, its movements more natural, more fluid than the twisted, jerky motions of the spirits I had seen. But as it came into sharper focus, my stomach dropped. The face, pale and gaunt, was locked in a permanent, silent scream. The eyes, those eyes, empty, hollow, staring straight ahead, unblinking, as if the soul inside had already fled, leaving behind nothing but an empty shell. The figure stumbled forward, as though it couldn't feel the ground beneath it, as if it was being dragged by an invisible force, tethered to the mountain. It disappeared just as quickly as it had appeared, and I stood frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the mind, that the isolation and fear were playing games with me. But deep down, I knew the truth. This was no hallucination. And then, it came again, another flash. This time, it was a different figure. A man, hunched over, his clothes ragged and torn as if he had been on the mountain for far too long. His eyes were wide, but not with fear. No, these eyes were empty, as though every ounce of emotion had been drained from him. He was walking slowly, aimlessly, as if he had long ago lost any sense of purpose. His skin was pale, the color of death, and his lips were cracked, as if he hadn't spoken in years. His feet shuffled, dragging against the snow-covered ground with a dreadful, mechanical rhythm. But when he looked up at me, I froze. His eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, met mine, and for a moment I saw a flicker of recognition, a flicker of plea. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out, just a silent scream, his face contorted in hopeless agony. Then, with one final, jerky motion, he turned and disappeared into the mist, just like the others. I was not alone. I had heard the stories of climbers lost on the mountain, those who had ventured too far, too deep into the heart of the peaks, only to vanish without a trace. The locals had whispered about them, ghosts, they called them, trapped forever in the snow, wandering the mountain in search of release. But I had always dismissed it as superstition, a tale spun by frightened villagers to explain the disappearances of those who had dared the climb. Now, I understood. I was seeing them, those climbers, the ones who had fallen before me. The ones who had walked the same path, followed the same pole, and been consumed by the mountain's curse. But their faces, their empty eyes, stayed with me. The agony, the terror, the hopelessness. These weren't just ghosts. These were the souls of those who had been lured into the mountain, just as I had been. They were trapped here, forced to wander in a never-ending cycle of despair, their bodies hollowed out, their spirits consumed by whatever malevolent force held sway over the mountain. They were warning me. I had to keep moving. I had to get out. But as I took another step, the ground beneath me seemed to shift, and once again I saw another flash, another figure. This time it was a woman, her face twisted in pain, her body emaciated, skin pulled tight over her bones. Her eyes were wide, and she stared directly at me, unblinking. Her mouth opened, and the silent scream was the same as the others. But this time, something was different. There was recognition in her gaze. She was looking at me as though she had known me, as though she had once been me. In an instant, the vision vanished, and I stumbled forward, my knees giving out beneath me. I caught myself on the rocky slope, gasping for breath, my chest tightening in panic. The mountain was pulling me into the same fate, into the same torment. I could feel it, it was coming for me. The cold, the darkness, the figures, they were all a part of it. The mountain itself was alive, and it was feeding on the souls of those who had ventured too far, luring them deeper into the abyss. It wanted me next. I could hear the whispering now, faint at first, like a distant murmur, but growing louder, more insistent, like a choir of the lost souls that had once been flesh. The voices of those who had failed, those who had succumbed to the pull, their voices blending into one horrible, pleading hum. Don't end up like us. Don't stay here. I shook my head, my mind spinning, struggling to hold on to myself. I couldn't become like them. I couldn't let the mountain take me. But I was losing the battle, and the pull was getting stronger. The flashes of the climbers, their hollow eyes, their faces twisted in terror, kept coming over and over until it felt like they were all around me, pushing me forward, pulling me deeper into their world of endless torment. The mountain was winning. It was slowly claiming me, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold on. I was running now, or at least trying to. My legs felt like jelly, barely carrying me over the jagged terrain, but I had no choice. The mountain, it was closing in around me. The mist had thickened to the point where I could hardly see more than a few feet in front of me, and the air had turned stifling, as though the mountain itself was breathing in time with my panicked gasps. I couldn't hear anything except the rush of my own breath and the pounding of my heart, and even that felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. But I could still feel the eyes of the lost climbers on me, watching me from within the fog, their hollow gazes never leaving me. They were all around, circling, waiting. Get away. Run. Now. My mind screamed at me to keep going, to push forward, but each step felt heavier than the last, my feet dragging as though the mountain itself was trying to hold me back. The whispers were louder now, indistinct voices blending into a single, unnerving hum. The figures moved with me, their forms appearing and vanishing in flashes, like bad dreams that never truly ended. I could feel their presence in every step I took, behind me, beside me, pushing me toward a place I couldn't escape from. I had to get to the edge, to the point where I could see the sky again, where I could escape the suffocating fog that had swallowed me whole. But as I stumbled up the slope, the landscape around me seemed to shift, twisting, turning, narrowing. The path had never felt so treacherous. Rocks that had been solid before now crumbled beneath my feet, and the ice beneath me cracked, threatening to swallow me whole. No. Not now. Not like this. I tried to steady myself, to keep my bearings, but I felt it, the mountain's grip tightening. It was as if the world itself was warping, bending under some unseen force, and every step I took only pulled me deeper into its grasp. I turned to look behind me, desperate for a glimpse of something, anything, real. But there was nothing. No sign of the village, no sign of escape. Just the endless fog, thickening with each passing second. I could hear the figures now, too close, too real. Their footsteps echoed in the mist, as though they were right behind me, as if they had been following me all along. A chill ran through me, colder than anything I had felt before. I had to escape. I had to keep moving. Keep moving. I pushed forward, my mind no longer functioning clearly. The need to flee, to escape whatever was coming for me, had consumed me. But with every step, I felt my body growing weaker, my legs slower, my heart thumping harder in my chest. The figures were closing in, their hands outstretched, as if they wanted me to join them, to follow them into the eternal dark. I took a step, then another, but the ground beneath me shifted again, and I felt myself lose my balance, slipping. My arms flailed, but I couldn't catch myself in time. I tumbled forward, my body crashing onto the icy slope, my breath knocked out of me. For a moment, everything went black. When my vision cleared, I realized with horror that I wasn't alone. The figures were standing around me, just out of reach, their hollow eyes fixed on mine. They didn't move. They just stared. And then, for the first time, I saw it clearly, the path before me, and the horrifying realization that it no longer led back. There was no way out. The mountain had swallowed me whole. I was already gone. The pull had been there from the beginning, hidden behind the fog, behind the stories, behind the whispers. The mountain had always known. It had been waiting for me to step too far, to push past the point of no return. And I had done it. I tried to stand, but my body refused to obey. My limbs were stiff, cold, numb, as though they weren't mine. I could feel the weight of the mountain pressing down on me, a suffocating force that seemed to drain the last bit of life from my bones. The figures surrounded me now, their faces as vacant as the void, their eyes empty of anything but the need to consume, to claim me as they had claimed so many before. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight. But as the fog thickened, as the figures drew closer, I realized something terrible. There would be no escape. The mountain had me. It had always had me. And now, I was nothing more than another lost soul, another whisper in the mist, another climber who had ventured too far, too deep, and been consumed by the endless hunger of the peaks. The fog closed in, and the world grew darker. And then, there was nothing. I tried to stand, to push myself to my feet, but the moment I lifted my hand to the ground, it felt like the very earth beneath me was alive, shifting, twisting like a living thing. The mountain, was changing, its landscape undulating in ways that defied reason. I blinked, trying to make sense of it, but the path I had followed just moments ago had vanished. Where had it gone? I spun in a circle, my legs weak and unsteady beneath me. The fog pressed in from all sides, thick and suffocating, as though it was waiting for me to realize something. Something terrible. I could no longer see the faint outline of the trail, the one I had followed for what felt like hours. The rocks, the snow, the jagged cliffs, they were different now. The mountain had changed. I tried to take a step in the direction I thought I had come from, but the ground beneath me shifted with an eerie, unnatural groan. It was as if the mountain itself had closed in around me, sealing off every possible escape. My breath quickened, the panic rising in my chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I was trapped. Trapped. My mind raced. Had I wandered off the path? Had I gone so deep into the mountain that there was no way out? I had to find the way back. I had to escape. But no matter which way I turned, the landscape shifted in front of me, rearranging itself like some twisted maze. The mountain wasn't just a place, it was a prison. It was alive. I could feel it pressing in around me, the walls of rock and ice closing in tighter, each step I took only leading me further into its heart. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold stone, but it felt as though the mountain was rejecting me, pushing me back. I took another step, and the rocks ahead seemed to ripple, blurring in my vision, as though I was seeing them through a thick veil. It was like the entire landscape was warping, becoming something other, something wrong. The whispers came again. Distant. Faint. Insistent. Turn back. I heard their voices, the lost ones, the climbers who had met the same fate. Their whispers blended with the wind, coming from every direction, pressing against my ears, urging me to stop, to give in. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I tried to force my legs to move, to push me forward, but it was like the mountain was holding me in place. With each step I took, I felt the ground shift beneath me, the terrain becoming less familiar, more foreign. The ice cracked beneath my boots, and I almost slipped. I caught myself, my hands bracing against a jagged rock, but I barely had time to steady myself before the entire slope beneath me buckled. No! I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest, panic rising in my throat. The mountain was toying with me, pulling me deeper into its grip, its ever-shifting terrain mocking my every move. There was no path. There was no way out. I was trapped in a place where time didn't matter, where the world didn't make sense, where the mountain was the only thing that existed. I looked around desperately, hoping for any sign of salvation. The fog hung thick in the air, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The sky, once a pale blue, was now a dull, oppressive gray, as though the mountain itself was sucking the light out of the world. I could feel the weight of the cold pressing in, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the temperature dropped with each passing second. I was running out of time. I glanced behind me, half expecting to see the ghostly climbers again, but the figures were gone. Instead, the fog swirled around me like some invisible, suffocating hand. I couldn't feel the wind anymore. It had died, leaving the air thick and still. That's when I saw it, a flicker in the distance, something moving between the trees. My heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Was it someone else? A rescuer? A fellow climber who had found his way back. I took a hesitant step toward it, but the ground beneath me shifted again. This time, I wasn't quick enough. The rock crumbled beneath my feet, and I pitched forward, the world spinning around me. I grabbed for anything, desperate to stop myself from falling, but the edge was too steep. My hands scraped against the jagged rocks, but nothing would stop the inevitable. I was falling, and I knew that once I hit the ground, I would never get up. The darkness was coming again, pulling at my consciousness, dragging me down into the endless fog. The mountain had me now. The path was gone. There was no way back. I had crossed a line, and it was too late to turn back. The mountain had claimed me, just like it had claimed the others before me. And I would never leave. I had barely managed to catch my breath before the shadows began to gather around me once more. It started slowly at first, faint, indistinct shapes moving at the edge of my vision. I tried to tell myself it was the fog playing tricks on me, or perhaps my mind was unraveling in the isolation. But as the shadows grew clearer, more defined, I knew they were back. The figures were everywhere now, rising from the fog like ghosts summoned from a forgotten past. One, then two, then more, each figure as lifeless as the last. Their eyes, hollow and empty, were fixed directly on me, and despite the distance between us, I could feel them seeing me, watching me with an intensity that was more than unsettling. It was as if they were waiting for something. Something I didn't want to understand. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. The air around me grew colder with every passing second, a biting chill that crept into my bones, and I could see my breath forming in the air, as though winter had suddenly come for me alone. The figures didn't move, at least, not in any way that made sense. They were standing, staring, their forms frozen in place. Some were still, while others appeared to be climbing, their limbs jerking unnaturally, like marionettes controlled by unseen strings. Their movements were mechanical, as though they were stuck in some eternal loop, trapped within their own death. The feeling of déjà vu hit me hard. These figures, these climbers, they were familiar, yet I knew I'd never seen them before. They had faces that seemed to blur the longer I looked at them, like fading photographs on the edge of memory. Their clothing was ragged, covered in layers of snow, and their eyes, those terrible, hollow eyes, they saw me. And they were not alone. The fog thickened again, and I could hear their whispers, distant but sharp, a chorus of voices echoing across the empty slopes. They were calling to me now, softly at first, but then louder, urging me forward. Join us. You can't leave. The mountain will keep you. I tried to block the voices out, but it was impossible. Their words wormed their way into my thoughts, twisting them until I couldn't tell where my fear ended and their voices began. I was frozen in place, my body trembling with a mix of fear and confusion. They had always been here, I realized, these figures, these lost souls, trapped in a never-ending cycle of climbing and dying, forever repeating their final moments. Had I become one of them? Was this the price of venturing too far into the mountain? Was this how they all started, the ones who had gone before me? Maybe they too had heard the same whispers, seen the same figures, and thought they could escape. But now, they were stuck. And now, I was too. The fog parted briefly, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the very edge of the figures, there was a shape, another figure, just like the others, but this one wasn't stationary. This one was moving. It was walking down the slope toward me, its face covered in a hooded cloak, its hands held out in front of it, as if beckoning me forward. I took a step back, heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. The figure moved closer, its steps deliberate, as if it knew me, as if it had been waiting for me. I wanted to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was trapped in place, drawn to the figure, my body fighting the instinct to flee. The other climbers, those who had been standing motionless, now began to move in unison, their eyes fixed on me with that same hollow, unblinking gaze. Their limbs jerked forward as if some unseen force was pulling them. Their steps were synchronized, unnatural. The mountain, it seemed, had begun to feed on me. It was repeating the same cycle it had with all the others. And now it was my turn. The figure in front of me reached out, its fingers long and pale, its face hidden in the shadow of the hood. I could feel its presence growing, wrapping around me, suffocating me. The others behind it were closing in, the entire group of them moving in perfect sync, drawn toward me, part of a procession that seemed to have no end. I heard the whispers grow louder, the voices crashing into my mind like waves. Join us. You can never leave. You are part of the cycle now. It hit me then. The terrible truth. This was the point of no return. There was no escape. I had become just like them. A lost soul bound to the mountain, to the endless cycle of climbing, dying, and repeating. The figures, those who had gone before me, were not just ghosts. They were part of a pattern, a curse that the mountain had long ago claimed, and I had walked straight into its trap. I had crossed the line, and there was no going back. No path. No escape. I was one of them now. I closed my eyes and took a shallow breath, feeling the pull of the mountain, of the figures, of the cycle that was already starting again. I was being drawn into the fog, pulled toward my inevitable end. And as I stepped forward, I knew that soon my eyes would be just as hollow as theirs, my body just as stiff, moving in a dance I couldn't control. The mountain had me, and it would have me forever. The figure in front of me was close now, its movements slow but deliberate. I could feel its presence, overwhelming in its coldness. It was no longer a vague shadow, no longer a faceless, distant being. It was real. It was there. And the other climbers, the ones that had been watching from the edges of my vision, waiting, had all stopped moving. Now, they too stood still, their eyes fixed on me, like silent spectators to a scene that had played out 1,000 times before. This figure, the one in the hooded cloak, was different from the rest. It was the only one who wasn't mimicking the broken, jerking movements of the others. It moved with purpose, it stepped soundless, yet the weight of its presence reverberated through the air. As it approached, the fog parted, and the true nature of its form began to reveal itself. The cloak was dark, tattered, and weathered, much like the others. But beneath it, there was something far worse, a face. It was not human. At least, not entirely. The face was pale, almost lifeless, but its eyes, they were alive. Cold, blue eyes that gleamed with something ancient. Something that had seen more deaths than I could comprehend. The skin was stretched thin, and there was a sharpness to its features, as if the figure had been carved from stone, its flesh barely clinging to its bones. And when it opened its mouth to speak, I could hear the sound of ancient whispers, like the wind passing through the cracks of a forgotten tomb. "You've come, just as they all have." The voice was raspy, distorted, like the wind itself had taken form. "The mountain calls to those who seek it, but it offers no salvation." I couldn't move. I wanted to speak, to scream, but my voice was trapped somewhere deep inside me. The figure's eyes burned into mine, and for a moment, I was no longer sure where I was. It was as if I had been pulled into another dimension entirely. The mountain, the fog, the figures, they all seemed to blur and distort around me, and I was left with only the face of the one before me. "You are part of it now." "A piece of the endless cycle," the figure continued, its words slow and deliberate. "This mountain does not give. It only takes. And it will never stop." The weight of its words crushed me. I wanted to deny it, to argue, but deep down, I knew the truth now. This was no ordinary mountain. It wasn't just a place. It was a prison, and I had walked straight into its trap. I tried to turn away, to run, but my body was no longer my own. My feet felt rooted to the ground, as though the very earth beneath me had claimed me. The figures around us stirred, their movements no longer jerky, no longer broken. They were synchronizing, forming a circle around us. There were more of them now, more than I could count. Each of them stood like sentinels, their eyes locked on me, watching my every move. The leader stepped forward again, and I felt a cold chill wash over me, as if I were being pulled deeper into the mountain, deeper into its grasp. "You are not the first," the leader said, its voice low, full of an ancient sorrow. "So many have come before you, all seeking to conquer, to understand. But all of them, every single one, they are trapped here now, just as you will be." A flash of memory hit me like a punch to the gut. The other climbers I had seen, the ones who had followed the same path, the ones whose eyes were empty and dead, they had once been like me. Once, they had been filled with the same hope, the same curiosity. But now, they were part of the mountain's endless hunger. And soon, I would be too. The fog thickened again, swirling around us, and the air grew colder still. I could feel it. This wasn't just a physical place. This was a cycle, a never-ending loop of death and rebirth. A trap that had claimed so many before me, and one that would claim me, too. "No," I whispered, my voice shaky, full of disbelief. "I don't want this. I can't." "You have no choice," the figure interrupted, its voice dark and unyielding. "You will follow the path, just as they all have. You will climb, and you will die. And then you will rise again, and you will climb once more. You will never leave." The ground beneath me seemed to tremble, the rocks shifting again. The faces of the other climbers, those who had once been alive, started to move, their eyes glowing with that same hollow, desperate emptiness. They were staring at me now, their mouths open in silent screams, as if they were begging for release. But there was no release. I could feel the weight of their eyes, the weight of their suffering. They had been trapped here for eternity, just as the figure had said. And now, I understood. I was part of it. I had always been part of it. The leader of the figure stepped closer, reaching out with a cold, bony hand. I didn't fight it. There was nothing to fight anymore. The mountain had claimed me, and there was no way out. "You will join us now," the figure said, its voice softening. "You will be one with the others. You will climb again." I closed my eyes, the tears burning against my skin, knowing there was no escape. No salvation. Only the endless cycle. And when I opened them again, I saw my own face reflected in the eyes of the figures surrounding me. Their hollow eyes. I was one of them now, and I always would be. The fog had thickened, the silence broken only by the eerie whispers of the mountain. I stood there, frozen, my body and mind locked in a struggle I could no longer fight. The cold had seeped deep into my bones, numbing everything except the terror that clung to my thoughts. But even that, in time, began to dull, like a fading memory. The figures surrounded me now, their eyes fixed on mine, unwavering and endless. Their presence, once terrifying, now felt inevitable. They were not just shadows anymore, not mere ghosts, but reflections of a fate I could not escape. Each one of them, a former climber, a lost soul who had come here seeking the same answers I had. But now, they were part of the mountain, bound to its cruel cycle of life and death, climbing eternally, trapped in a loop of reincarnation that I had no hope of breaking. I looked around at their hollow faces, each one as tortured as the last, each one just as lost. There was no anger in their eyes, no resentment, only a quiet, resigned understanding that this was their reality now, their world. And now it was mine too. I tried to resist the pull, but my legs refused to move. I was drawn toward them, as though invisible hands were gripping me, guiding me into the fold of the cycle. There was no other way out. No way to break free from the mountain's grasp. I had seen it too clearly now, the way the fog shifted, the way the figures moved, how they were all connected in an endless loop of ascents and falls. There was no beginning. There was no end. And there was no escape. A voice, distant but clear, echoed through my mind. "You will join us." The same voice I had heard before, the one that had whispered in the corners of my mind, urging me forward. It was no longer a voice that frightened me. It was a voice that offered a strange sense of peace, a release from the endless struggle. I tried to recall the faces of the people I had known, the ones I had left behind. But their images were fading, slipping away like sand through my fingers. I had forgotten what it felt like to be part of the world outside the mountain, and the longer I stood there, the harder it became to remember why I had ever fought so hard to escape. The need for freedom, for answers, all of it was fading. The figures around me didn't move. They simply stood, their forms unmoving, their eyes locked on me with an unspoken understanding. I could feel their presence, their calm, and a part of me, some small part that was still human, wanted to fight, wanted to scream. But it was useless. The leader, the one who had first spoken to me, moved closer, and this time there was no fear in its presence, no dread. The figure's hand, cold and skeletal, rested gently on my shoulder, and I felt the weight of eternity in its touch. It was not an attack. It was a gesture of belonging. I closed my eyes, the tears flowing freely now, but no longer in fear. They were tears of acceptance, tears of surrender. I was no longer fighting it. I could feel the truth settling in my chest like a weight I could no longer carry. This is it. This was what I had come to. I had walked into the mountain, driven by curiosity, by adventure, by the hope of discovery. And now, I understood. The mountain had always been waiting for me. It had called to me, just as it had called to so many others before. The figures, the leader, they were not tormenting me. They were welcoming me. They were showing me the path I could no longer deny. I could see it now, clearly, fully. The endless climb, the inevitable fall. This was the way of the mountain. The only way. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly, the cold air stinging my lungs, but I didn't flinch. I no longer needed to. There was no more fear, no more fight. Only the acceptance of what was to come. The cycle was unbreakable. The past and the future collided here, at the peak of the mountain, where time had no meaning. And I, too, would become a part of it. I would climb, and I would die. And then I would rise again, just as the others had, and I would climb once more. The mountain would claim me, just as it had claimed them, and there would be no escape, no way to break free. In that moment, I knew my place. I would join the figures, moving silently along the mountain, always climbing, never reaching the summit. I would become a part of the story that had played out for so long, and I would never, ever escape. I was one of them now. I had always been one of them. And as I stepped forward, into the mist, I understood at last that there was no ending. Only the endless cycle, forever, on the mountain. The fog had thickened to the point where I could no longer see anything beyond my own hands. I stood in the midst of it, shrouded by the oppressive silence of the mountain. The weight of its presence pressed in on me from all sides, heavy and suffocating. It was as though the very air was alive, wrapping around me, drawing me deeper into its endless void. And then I heard it, the sound of my own breath. But it was not my breath alone. There was something else there, something close. Something watching. The figures shifted around me, their silent forms moving with a precision that felt as old as the mountain itself. I could hear their footsteps, soft and steady, just out of reach, their shadows flitting in and out of my vision. They were circling me now, like a vengeful tide, pulling me further into the abyss. My heart raced. My legs trembled. But it was no use. There was nowhere left to run. No path to take. The leader stepped forward again, its cold gaze never leaving mine. Its mouth opened, but there was no voice now, no whisper. Only the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears, quickening with each passing second. It was then that I realized something I have refused to acknowledge before. The mountain was not just a place. It was a living entity, a prison of suffering, and I was one of the many souls trapped within it. My life, my past, was nothing now. Only the climb remained. Only the cycle. The mountain had claimed me, just as it had claimed the others, and I was no longer a part of the world outside. I could feel my body growing heavier, as though the weight of the mountain itself was pressing down on me, pulling me into its depths. The fog closed in tighter, and I felt my vision begin to blur. The figures around me began to merge together, becoming one mass of shadowy forms. I was losing myself in them, becoming them. And with that realization, I felt a strange calmness wash over me. There was no need to fight. There was no need to scream. And yet, as if from nowhere, a raw, desperate cry tore itself from my throat. It echoed through the mountain, bouncing off the rocks and slipping into the endless fog, a final, futile attempt to resist. But the sound was swallowed by the mountain. No one would hear me. No one would come. The leader's eyes softened, just for a moment, as if acknowledging the inevitable. Then, without another word, it turned away, joining the others as they began their descent down the mountain once more. I tried to follow, but my body felt foreign to me now. It wasn't mine anymore. The cold had settled deep within me, freezing every thought, every instinct. My legs moved on their own, stepping forward, following the procession. The figures walked ahead, their forms melding together as if they were one, and I, too, became part of them. My body moved as though guided by something beyond me, by the mountain, by the cycle, by the endless climb that would never end. I felt my own identity slipping away. My name, my past, everything that had defined me, faded into the fog. There was only the climb. The eternal climb. The mountain had swallowed me whole, and now I was no more than a shadow among the rest. My scream, that final desperate cry, was swallowed by the wind and the stone, becoming part of the mountain's unyielding song. The cycle would continue. I was one of them now. And as the fog enveloped me, I felt my presence merge with theirs. The figures, now a part of the eternal procession, walked silently into the mountain's depths, each step carrying us further away from the world we had known. We were all the same now, trapped, climbing, falling, forever lost in the folds of time and space. The mountain had claimed us all, and we would never escape. We would never stop climbing. And in the distance, the first figure that had led me down this path, myself, now, took a step forward, ready to begin the journey again. The cycle would continue. Forever. The wind howled through the village as the first flakes of snow began to fall, dusting the rooftops in a soft, white blanket. The small Montana village seemed even quieter than usual that evening, the streets empty save for the occasional shadow that flitted between the buildings. The few locals who remained in town spoke in hushed tones, their eyes lingering on the dark silhouette of the mountain rising above the valley. A quiet unease gripped the place as it always did when the seasons shifted, when the mountain began to show its true nature. But in the shadow of the mountain's grip, a newcomer had arrived. He stepped off the bus, his backpack slung over one shoulder, eyes bright with the spark of adventure. His name was Lucas, a young man from a distant city, far removed from the quiet fear that clung to this remote corner of Montana. To him, the village was nothing more than a place to rest before tackling the peak of the mountain that loomed so majestically above them. He had heard whispers about the mountain before, but the stories seemed too far-fetched to believe. Ghosts on the mountain? A cursed place where climbers never returned? He scoffed at the idea, brushing it off as nothing more than the wild imaginations of superstitious locals. The wind bit at his skin as he made his way toward the small inn at the edge of the village. Inside, the warmth of the fire beckoned, and he gratefully stepped into the quiet space, his boots scraping against the wooden floor. The innkeeper, an elderly man with weathered skin and eyes that seemed to have seen too much, glanced up from behind the counter. "Welcome," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You're here for the mountain, I take it?" Lucas nodded enthusiastically, not yet noticing the way the man's gaze flickered nervously toward the window, as if watching something unseen. "That's right," Lucas replied, settling into a nearby chair. "I've read about it. It's supposed to be a challenging climb, but I'm up for it. I've been preparing for months." The innkeeper sighed, his hand hovering over the register. For a moment, he seemed to hesitate, as though considering whether to speak at all. Finally, he met Lucas's eyes, his face drawn with concern. "You should be careful," the old man warned. "The mountain, it has a way of pulling people in. It's not like other climbs." "Not at all." Lucas chuckled, brushing it off. "Thanks for the advice, but I'm not one to back down. I've climbed tougher peaks than this." The innkeeper's expression hardened, and for a moment it seemed as though the old man was going to say more. But instead, he merely gave a stiff nod and handed Lucas the room key. "I'll make sure you have a good night's rest, but remember this, if you climb the mountain, you're not just climbing rock and snow. It's got a history." Lucas took the key, his curiosity piqued, but the innkeeper's words only lingered at the edge of his thoughts. He was here for adventure, for the thrill of the challenge, and no old man's warnings were going to change that. That night, as Lucas lay in bed, the wind howling outside, he thought about the stories he had overheard in the inn. Something about ghostly figures, people disappearing without a trace, but the words felt like shadows in his mind. He turned over, trying to shake the unease crawling up his spine. But the mountain was calling him, and he was ready to answer. At dawn, he would begin his ascent. And the mountain, silent and waiting, would welcome him into its embrace. What Lucas didn't know, what none of them ever knew, was that the mountain's call was not one of invitation. It was one of inevitability. The cycle was waiting, and he, like so many before him, was already a part of it. The moment he had set foot in the village, the mountain had marked him as its own. The ghosts were waiting. They always were. And with each step Lucas took toward the peak, the mountain would shift, guiding him toward the same fate that had claimed so many others before him. The cycle would continue, as it always had, as it always would. Forever. And in the distance, the first ghostly figure of the mountain, its hollow eyes full of endless regret, would take its first step forward to greet him. The cycle, once begun, could never be stopped. The morning light cast a pale glow over the village as Lucas set out on his hike. The cold air bit at his skin, but he hardly noticed. His eyes were focused on the towering mountain before him, its peak hidden in a veil of clouds. He had studied the trail maps, packed his gear, and was ready for the challenge. As he made his way through the quiet streets, the villagers went about their daily routines, casting brief, watchful glances in his direction. There was a sense of unease in the air, something he couldn't quite place, but which hung around the village like a forgotten memory. An old man, bent and weary, stood near the village's well. His face was lined with years of hardship, and his eyes, dark and sunken, followed Lucas with a sense of knowing that chilled him. The villagers avoided him, as they always did. He was the one who still believed in the old stories, the ones about the mountain and the spirits that roamed its slopes. He had seen them all come and go, young men and women with wide eyes and eager hearts, just like Lucas, who believed that the mountain could be conquered. The old man's voice, though quiet, carried weight, for it had witnessed the slow deaths of so many who had made the same mistake. "You there," the old man called to Lucas, his voice rasping like gravel. Lucas paused and turned, slightly startled. "Yes?" he asked, a faint smile on his face, thinking perhaps the man needed something. "Don't go up there," the old man warned, pointing a gnarled finger toward the mountain. "The mountain doesn't welcome strangers. It takes them, takes their souls." Lucas felt a slight chill at the man's words, but shrugged it off. "I've read about it. It's just an old legend, right? I'm prepared for whatever the mountain throws at me." The old man's eyes narrowed, his expression filled with a quiet, sorrowful certainty. The mountain doesn't just throw things at you. It lures you. And once you're in its grip, there's no escape. Not for you, not for anyone. The villagers who overheard this exchange exchanged uneasy glances. The old man had always been like this, muttering about spirits and death, but there was an edge to his voice today, an urgency. Still, they said nothing. It was easier to ignore him than to face the truth. They had all seen the newcomers come and go over the years, but none of them ever returned. Lucas, still unaware of the weight in the old man's warning, smiled and nodded. "I'm sure I'll be fine," he said, offering a brief wave as he began his trek toward the mountain's base. But the old man didn't move. His gaze remained fixed on the young climber's retreating form, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. He had seen it happen too many times, saw the look in their eyes, the same stubborn certainty that had led to their doom. The villagers, though they did not speak aloud, felt the tension in the air. They had lived with the knowledge of the mountain's curse for generations. It was a curse that had claimed so many lives, and yet no one ever seemed to remember the warnings of those who had come before. They whispered to one another in the corners of the village, passing on their stories to their children, hoping that one day someone would listen. But they knew better. The mountain's call was strong. It always was. As Lucas ventured further away, the old man turned, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of the world had settled on them once more. He knew it was too late. There was no turning back now. The cycle would begin again. And so, the whispers began, quiet and persistent. The villagers spoke of the young climber, their voices barely audible over the wind. They spoke of the mountain's dark history, the spirits that roamed its slopes, and the ones who had gone up and never returned. But there was no stopping it. No one could save him. No one had ever been able to. The mountain stood silent, an imposing mass against the horizon. Its jagged peaks pierced the sky, their snow-covered tips lost in the clouds. The wind that howled through the valleys seemed to whisper, pulling at the edges of the world, as if the mountain itself were waiting, watching. Lucas, unaware of the growing presence behind him, made his way up a worn trail, the crunch of his boots breaking the eerie stillness. The path was long, steep, and treacherous, but he felt the excitement pulse through him. The challenge of the climb. The thrill of conquering something so ancient, so powerful. But as he ascended, something shifted. The air grew colder, the weight of the atmosphere pressing down on him. It wasn't the usual chill of mountain air, it was deeper, more unnerving, like the mountain itself was breathing. Each gust of wind seemed to carry a murmur, a whisper too faint to understand, but loud enough to stir a deep, unshakable feeling of unease. Lucas shook it off. He was a seasoned climber. He had been to mountains before, climbed tougher peaks, faced worse conditions. The thoughts of fear and doubt were fleeting, quickly dismissed by his inner resolve. Yet, with every step, the mountain seemed to loom larger, more menacing. The silence between the gusts of wind felt wrong, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The trail wound up and tight, twisting turns, the terrain becoming increasingly rugged. Sharp rocks jutted out of the earth like teeth, and the snow crunched beneath his boots with a satisfying crack. The higher he climbed, the more isolated he felt. The village, small and insignificant in the distance, disappeared from view. The only sound now was the rhythmic pounding of his heart and the occasional whistle of the wind through the high rocks. It was then that Lucas felt it, an unsettling sensation, as though something was watching him. At first, he dismissed it as nothing more than the mountain's vastness playing tricks on his mind. But the feeling persisted, a prickling along the back of his neck, the hairs on his arms standing on end. As he climbed, the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, curling around him like fingers. The daylight waned, the clouds thickening, and the wind howled louder. Yet, in the midst of the storm, Lucas began to notice something: movement. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of shadow at the corner of his eye, a shift in the snow that seemed to move without cause. His gaze darted to the edges of the trail, but there was nothing there. Nothing at all. He continued onward, the unease growing, but still, he pressed forward. The summit was within reach, and he refused to let anything stop him now. But the mountain was changing. It seemed to pulse with an energy that was not of this world, its vast face watching him, the rocks beneath his feet shifting as if the ground itself were alive. The trail seemed to wind in unnatural ways, turning back upon itself as though it had a mind of its own, coaxing him deeper into its heart. Every now and then, Lucas would hear a faint, distant sound: footsteps, voices. But when he paused to listen, there was only the wind, howling and wailing as it twisted around the jagged peaks. A strange tension hung in the air, a sense of being not just alone, but watched. The mountain, ancient and patient, had waited for this moment for so long. It had seen so many like him, climbers full of ambition, driven by the lure of the summit, ignorant of the curse that gripped the mountain's soul. And now, it would claim him, just as it had claimed them all. The sun, hidden behind the swirling clouds, cast the world in a gray, dim light. The shadows seemed to deepen with every step he took, stretching out from the rocks, creeping into the corners of his vision. Lucas felt the pull, an almost magnetic force drawing him upward, urging him to continue even though a deep, gnawing dread began to take root in his chest. The mountain watched. It always did. It had watched countless souls come and go, and now it was watching him. But Lucas was too focused on the path ahead to see the truth, how it bent and twisted, how it led him deeper into the heart of the mountain where no one could ever return from. Too focused on his own thoughts, on the thrill of the climb, to realize that the mountain was alive, and it was not his to conquer. He was merely its next prey. The mountain loomed higher now, its peak nearly obscured by a thick curtain of clouds. Lucas's breath came in ragged gasps, the thin air stinging his lungs, but his determination was unwavering. He was alone now, the world falling silent around him except for the haunting wail of the wind. The path had narrowed, winding through rocky outcrops and patches of icy snow. Yet he pressed on, the climb pushing him further into the heart of the mountain where few had ever dared to venture. But what Lucas did not know, what no one had ever known, is that the mountain never forgets. It had seen countless souls tread this same path, year after year, their footsteps swallowed by the earth as they disappeared into its cold embrace. And now, it was his turn. He took another step, unaware that the moment he had crossed the village's threshold, he had entered a cycle, an ancient and unyielding loop. Every step forward was not his own choice, it was the mountain's. Every turn of the trail had been set long ago, an inevitability that he, like those before him, could not escape. The rocks beneath his feet had once supported other climbers, the same rocks that had slowly shifted to lead them to their doom. The cold bite of the wind stung his face, but it was more than the chill of the air. The coldness seemed to seep into his very bones, sinking deeper with every step, as if the mountain itself were clawing at his soul. The air had grown denser, more suffocating. His heart hammered in his chest, the pressure in his head mounting. But he did not turn back. The summit was close now, so close he could almost taste it. The echoes of distant footsteps reverberated through the wind, but when Lucas paused and strained his ears to listen, they vanished. He thought it was nothing more than the wind playing tricks on him, but the sound, footsteps, felt too distinct to ignore. And then, a flicker at the corner of his vision, a shadow, moving fast, too fast to be real. He blinked, his mind momentarily confused. But when he looked again, there was nothing there. The path narrowed further, winding precariously along a steep cliffside. The mountain pressed in on him, a looming presence that seemed to have a life of its own. Lucas's pulse quickened. The air, once still and cold, now carried something else, something more sinister. The whisper of the wind had changed, now carrying low murmurs that sounded like voices, indistinct but chilling. It was as if the mountain was speaking, its ancient voice rising with the wind. Another shadow flickered ahead, just beyond his sight. Lucas froze, his body rigid with unease. The air felt wrong, thick with an oppressive weight. For the first time since starting the climb, doubt crept into his mind. He had read the stories, the old legends whispered by the villagers, but he had dismissed them as mere superstition. Now, as the wind howled louder and the shadows seemed to grow nearer, the doubts began to creep in. Was he truly alone? He forced himself to move, but with every step, the air grew colder, the shadows more pronounced, and the whispers louder. It was then that the mountain seemed to shift underfoot, the path no longer a clear trail but a twisting maze of jagged rocks and snowdrifts. He glanced back, the way he had come now obscured by a swirling mist, as if the mountain had claimed the path he had walked, erasing it from his memory. A strange, sickening sensation filled his stomach. He looked around, but all that met his eyes were the darkening shadows and the stark white of the snow. There were no landmarks, no signposts. The mountain had become a labyrinth, and he an unwitting part of its cycle. Then, it happened, Lucas turned a corner, and there, ahead of him, were figures. Figures dressed in the same hiking gear as he, their faces obscured by shadows, their movements stiff and unnatural. At first, he thought they were fellow climbers, but something in the way they moved, their deliberate, unblinking march down the mountain, sent a chill through his spine. They were too perfect, too still. The silence around them was unnerving, yet there was an air of familiarity in their presence. It took Lucas a moment to realize these figures, these ghostly figures, were walking down the same path he was following. They were moving in the opposite direction, their pace steady, as though they were drawn to something just out of sight. And then it hit him, this was not the first time the mountain had claimed a climber. These were the souls of those who had come before him, trapped in a never-ending loop, repeating the same steps, the same tragic path, each time another unwitting climber arrived to take their place. A sense of terror rose in his chest. He wanted to turn back, but the mountain had already made its decision. The path ahead was blocked, and the figures in front of him, once strangers, now seemed strangely familiar. They were the ones who had walked this path before, their faces frozen in terror, their eyes hollow and lifeless, as though they had been walking for centuries. They were trapped here, just like the others, part of the cycle. The cycle had begun again. Lucas was now one of them. The summit was within his reach, just a few more steps. Lucas's heart raced, the thrill of nearing the top surging through him. The clouds parted for a moment, and the dim light of the sun illuminated the peak in a ghostly glow. It felt surreal, like stepping into another world, and as the wind howled around him, a sense of completion began to settle in his chest. He had made it. He had conquered the mountain. Or so he thought. But then, as his boots crunched against the snow-covered summit, something changed. The air grew even colder, the temperature plummeting as if the mountain itself were expelling him. He felt an unexplainable pressure on his chest, a weight that pressed down on him from all sides. His breath came out in visible puffs, but it was no longer just the cold. There was something oppressive, something suffocating in the air. As he took another step forward, the world seemed to shift. The mist that had rolled in from the edges of the peak seemed to swirl, thickening, coiling around him like a living thing. It wasn't just a fog, there was movement within it. Shapes, shadows, figures. At first, Lucas dismissed them as mere hallucinations, the product of exhaustion and the altitude. But as the mist parted briefly, he saw them clearly. The figures were there, standing in the swirling fog, just beyond the reach of his outstretched hand. They were the same as the ones he had seen before, climbers, their forms frozen in time, faces obscured by shadows and a faint, ghostly glow. They stood in unnatural stillness, their bodies slightly swaying, as if caught in a perpetual wind, yet there was no breeze. Their eyes, hollow and lifeless, stared straight ahead, fixed on nothing. The air around them vibrated with an unearthly tension. Lucas froze, his breath caught in his throat. He wanted to move, to run, but his feet felt rooted to the ground, as if the mountain itself were holding him in place. The figures seemed to notice him now, their heads slowly turning, their blank eyes locking onto his with chilling familiarity. A terrible realization dawned on him. They weren't just standing there, they were waiting for him to join them. One of the figures, taller, more distinct than the others, took a single, deliberate step toward him. The mist seemed to part for it, the figure emerging from the fog like a phantom, its movement impossibly slow, yet inevitable. As it drew closer, Lucas could feel the weight of its presence, the gravity of its gaze, pulling him in. He wanted to scream, but no sound came from his throat. The mountain was silent now, the wind gone, the world reduced to just him and these figures. The figure's face was still obscured by the shadows, but there was no mistaking the sense of recognition. This was the same figure from the shadows on the trail, the one that had walked ahead of him, leading him deeper into the mountain. This was the face of the climber who had come before, whose fate had been sealed long ago, just as his own now was. He backed away, his mind screaming for him to flee, but his legs refused to move. It was too late. The figure's hand reached out toward him, its fingers long and pale, and for the first time, Lucas saw the desperation in its movements. The figure wasn't reaching for him, it was pulling him in. Suddenly, the ground beneath him seemed to tremble. The mountain groaned, a deep, resonating sound that shook him to his core. The mist closed in tighter, and the figure's hand, cold as ice, grasped his arm. A freezing wave of panic rushed through him as he felt himself pulled toward the figure, drawn into the swirling fog. He fought it, tried to break free, but it was no use. The mountain had claimed him, just as it had claimed every climber before him. The cycle was not one of survival, it was a cycle of death and rebirth, and he was now part of it. The figure's touch was an anchor, its presence a final push, and before Lucas could fully comprehend what was happening, the world around him began to fade. The sharp edges of reality blurred, the mountain and the mist dissolving into nothingness. His body felt weightless, as though he were being pulled apart, erased from the very fabric of existence. Then, the mountain was silent again, and Lucas was gone. But somewhere, in the deep, eternal fog of the peak, the figures continued to walk endlessly, forever, each one part of the same tragic procession, waiting for the next climber to arrive. The cycle had begun anew. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.